Good afternoon. Thank you for your attention over the last 2 weeks. I want to take you back to the fall of 2006. Bryan Pata was a senior at the University of Miami. He had everything going for him. He was about to enter the NFL draft. The season was coming to a close. He switched positions. His draft stock was rising. One of the top agents had just called him. Everything was going Bryan Pata's way. He was about to make it to the NFL. His dream to buy his mom a house. Everything was just within reach. You heard that Bryan Pata was a car enthusiast, a gun enthusiast. He had a girlfriend, Jada. You heard from their roommate, Dwayne Hendricks. They had a little dog together. Now, on November 7th of 2006, that dream ended because of the jealousy of this man over here, the defendant, Rashaun Jones. So on the flip side of Bryan Pata, who had everything going for him at that time, we have Rashaun Jones, a star football player from Lake City, Florida. He comes to the University of Miami, where he's no longer the star. The competition level's higher, everyone's good. But here we are now in his junior year. It's now the fall of 2006. But in order to understand why Rashaun Jones would want to kill Bryan Pata, we have to go back to 2004 when the defendant started at the University of Miami. The defendant came in, like all the football players do, in the summer. Their practices, they all start, they get to know each other, and they live in the same dorms in the summer. So the first interaction they had that was not on the football field, that was not related to practice, you heard Eric Moncor and Dave Howell tell you about what happened. So one night, Eric and Bryan come back to Eric's dorm room, and they go to open the door. The door is locked. The door, these are suites connected by a bathroom. Both Eric's door and his roommate's door are locked. They leave them unlocked. And he's like, okay, no one opens the door. They go upstairs to their friend Dave Howell's room. Dave comes back down with them. And as they get to the hallway door, they can see through as they're going. They see the defendant coming out of Eric's room. They call out to him. They walk down the hall. He comes back, and now you saw the size of these guys. There are now Eric, Dave, Bryan, who's bigger than Eric and Dave, who you saw walk past you, and the defendant inside this single dorm room. There's not a lot of room. So Eric, Dave, Bryan, mainly Bryan, asking questions. Why are you here? What were you doing? Why were you in his room? Bryan is more protective of Eric's room than Eric. And this turns into a fight, a fist fight. When that fist fight ends, so Bryan hits Rashaun. This is Bryan, not Rashaun. Bryan hits Rashaun. Rashaun leaves. And what does Rashaun do? Rashaun brings a gun into this. Says,
Objection,
you better,
statement of the testimony.
You better clip up. What does clip up mean? You better go get your gun. This is not something that the players said to each other. This is not something people who are friendly say to each other. This is a threat. A threat to Bryan that you better go get your gun. Dave takes Bryan out of the dorms that night, and practice goes on. They all move on. Or so everyone else does. So now we go to later that fall, and Dave is in the dorms. And what does Dave see the defendant with? Dave Howell sees the defendant with a small caliber, black, snub-nosed revolver. Why does he remember this? He's never seen a gun before in his life. It's imprinted in his mind. He's now seen a gun. This is the first gun he's ever seen in person. This is why Dave remembers this. And these are things that don't become important until much later. So, in the fall of 2006, Rashaun can't get out of his own way. He's not a starter on the football team. He's not dating Jada Brody. He's tested positive for marijuana for the second time, which is a big deal when you are on a scholarship and subject to NCAA and the University of Miami rules. So second time, now you can't play for 2 games. If you test positive a third time, you're done. So Rashaun now is always in trouble for stupid little things. You heard from his teammates. Showing up late to study hall, showing up late to class, not keeping his grades up, testing positive for marijuana. It's always something with Rashaun. So on November 7th of 2006, the drug test results have come in, and Rashaun is brought into a meeting where you heard from Tony Hernandez. He's brought into a meeting and told, you just failed your second drug test, here's the letter, it's all official. You are suspended for the next 2 football games. You can't practice with the team and you're not playing. You heard from them that they still have access to the sports trainers, the weight room, so they can keep working out, but they are not on the football field with the rest of their teammates. Now Rashaun is down, it's 3 strikes and you're out. This is his second strike. This is not a good day for the defendant. So he goes home to lick his wounds, think about what he's gonna do, and he goes back to his apartment. Now, when he goes back to his apartment, he changes his phone number. You've heard the testimony. He calls Verizon, or Sherry calls Verizon. Someone gets him this new phone number. You heard the defendant's own statement. Why did he get this phone number? He said because he didn't want to disappoint his mom, his grandmother, his family. He didn't want people calling him. His phone records are in evidence. Look at who he's calling. He gets this phone, and Sherry's number is highlighted in pink. Sergeant Cremasini marked who was making the phone call next to it. So, the defendant calls Sherry and dials *67 to block his number. That is at 4:11. Then, Sherry calls him back. Right after that, or an hour later at 5:07. So what we have is someone who doesn't want people to have his number, said this by his own words. First he's calling his girlfriend. First he's calling his girlfriend from a blocked number. That's not something you do. It's not on his phone records from the days before. And what do we know? He's given his phone number to his friend Bruce. Bruce is highlighted in blue here. So this first call is at 17:50 with Bruce, so 5:50. Then he talks to Sherry again at Pottery Barn at 5:57. Then we have Bruce. I want to look at these blue right here. He talks to Bruce a lot that day. Bruce is one of his best friends. He talks to Bruce at 6:34, and again at 6:41. And you can look at the columns, you can see how long they talked. 6:34. What's happening at this time? You heard from all these football players. Practice ends, they go to the showers, they change, They all head home. Bruce has called him, and what does the defendant know? He knows that practice is over, and whether Bruce specifically told him, he knows that Bryan Pata is on his way home from practice. He knows exactly what time he would be heading that way. So now, there are no phone calls between 6:41 and 7:39. The only people who could have the defendant's phone number at this time, he's changed his number, are the people that he's told. So, is he not getting a lot of calls during this time period? Yes. It's less than an hour. Now, you're going to go confront someone. You're going to go murder someone. I want to submit this question to you. Do you take your cell phone with you? If you do you turn your cell phone off? I'm showing you Stage 30. Detective Segovia showed you on a map where the defendant lives at Bermuda Village, and he shows you, where Bryan Pata lived at the Colony Apartments, where Bryan Pata was murdered. And the distance between these two locations on foot is about 1.2 miles, just over a mile. Rashaun Jones is a college football player. He is in shape. You heard from all the players, all these practices, twice a day that they had to go through. I submit to you, in that period of time, Rashaun Jones can easily run from his apartment to the defendant's, where he can be waiting in the shadows for Bryan Pata to come back from practice. We heard from the teammates. That day at practice, Rashaun's off sulking at home. The rest of the team on the football field practicing. The defense was beating up on the offense. You heard from Eric. Kareem had a hit. Bryan had a hit. He had a hit. They're in a great mood. It's their coach's birthday. It's Coach Hurt's birthday. They dumped the water cooler on him. It's a Tuesday practice, full pads. They're tired, upbeat, happy. This is how practice ends. They go to the locker room. Eric told you he's still sitting there just like exhausted. Everyone else is getting out of the showers. And that's the last time he talks to his friend Bryan. You heard from Bryan's roommate, Dwayne. Practice has ended. They're about to go their separate ways. Bryan says, I'll see you at the crib. He'll see him back at the house. He hears two freshmen call out and ask Bryan for a ride back to the dorms, which is on the way. And what do we know happens next? Bryan drives the freshman players back to the dorms. Dwayne drives home and stops for gas on the way. And Bryan speaks to his brother, calls his brother Fentanyl on the way home. Normal conversation. Talk about cars. Bryan is he's a car guy. He liked to buy old cars, fix them up, put fun colors, candy color paint on these cars, and then sell them. So he customizes the cars, makes them look pretty, sells them, makes a little money on the side. So he's talking to his brother Fed about their mutual love of cars, what color he should paint his car, what are they going to do. And Fed, his brother Fentanyl, knows he gets home. Fentanyl told you that Bryan, as a car guy, installed aftermarket car accessories, aftermarket alarms, that Fentanyl thought that the delay on his car for the lights was set at a minute, so it's not a factory setting. It's an alarm, a specialty car alarm. Something that Dave also told you. Dave has now gone to another school, has transferred, but he knew how much his friend loved cars, and that he used to install fun alarms on his car, like something he called a kill switch. If someone took the car and the car would just shut off. Why this becomes important later when Paul Connor sees the lights on his car. So Bryan heads home, gets off the phone with his brother, gets out of the car. what happens next? We know that this is Bryan Pata's black Infiniti. He pulled into his parking place, he parks his car, he gets out of the car. He locks his car. The delayed lights don't start until he hits the button and locks his car. So Bryan walks around from the side of his car, down the path between his apartment building and the bushes, up towards his apartment. As he's walking, we know he got shot. How do we know he got shot there? Dr. Liu told you as soon as he was shot, he would have been incapacitated. He would have fallen to the ground. He couldn't do anything at that time. So this is where Bryan Pata landed. And if you look, you can see, I know it's hard to look at these photos, so I'm showing you what's been entered as State's Exhibit 14. I'm sorry, the last was State's Exhibit 3. You can see where his body was rolled over when he got medical treatment. You can see how he fell with his head on the pavement. And you can see his cell phone, his sidekick, and they called it the chirp, both his phones, as the other players told you, just out of his hands. And his keys right next to his hand. He was headed to his apartment when he was surprised by the defendant. His sidekick. His two phones. What happens next? So the defendant, who knew when practice was over, who got a phone call, so this isn't just a guess, got a phone call from his teammate, his good friend on the team, tells him that practice is over. He's now had time to go to Bryan Pata's apartment, where, as you see, Bryan's car with the Pata license plate is the car on the end. There's a dumpster there. The lights for the apartment stop over on the side by the wall, the entryway. And I submit to you, the defendant was there laying in wait to confront Bryan Pata when he got out of his car. Bryan, suspecting nothing, is walking up towards his apartment when he's shot in the head. What does the defendant do at that time? I'm showing you State's Exhibit 2 and 1. The defendant, you can see just inside this apartment how close Bryan's car was to the entry. The defendant turns and briskly leaves the apartment building. Unfortunately for him, as he exits, see there's a couple street lights right here, and you heard the testimony of Paul Connor. He passes right by Paul Connor, who was walking home from the Metro that day. Passes right by under the lights.
Objection to the statement of the testimony.
Where he crosses path to a Paul Connor, gives a slight smile. Paul Connor is about to go enter the apartment complex, turns his head, and sees the defendant start to take off. Not towards the car, starts to take off the path in the direction of his apartment. Paul Connor continues to walk into the apartment complex parking lot where Bryan Pata's car with a 48-second light delay, the lights are still on. This is why that timing is so important. Paul Connor, just before he sees the defendant, hears a pop like a cherry bomb. And then he sees the defendant. He sees him up close on the sidewalk just outside the apartment. So there's a pop, sees the defendant, walks inside, lights are on. There's no one else around. Paul Connor doesn't even notice that Bryan Pata is lying in the bush. But it makes sense. One person walks past you on the sidewalk. One person is face down on the sidewalk, hidden by a bush. Two things can be true. He can see the defendant and not see Bryan. Paul Connor is the first person there, the only person there. And Paul Connor doesn't know what he's seen, doesn't know the significance, and continues to walk to his apartment. He goes to his apartment, goes to bed for the night. In the morning, sees some police tape, some media, gets to work, turns on the news, and finds out that Bryan Pata's been murdered. Paul Connor puts two and two together and contacts the Miami-Dade Police Department, where he gives a full interview the day after the homicide of what he's seen. So all these area canvases, no one else comes forward, but Paul Connor comes forward immediately before they can even knock on his door and tells the police what he's seen because it's important. I'm showing you State's Exhibit 6. Now, you also heard Paul Connor testify that he was shown a lineup. And he got a good look at the defendant, and he picked him out of this lineup. He doesn't hesitate, he sees him, and he identifies the person that he saw that evening. Now, defense stood up here in opening and told you just 90%. That's true. This is a professor who did not believe in certainties. And I submit to you that's why he wrote 90%. These photos come from law enforcement databases. The police have to use the photos they have. They can't just go take a current photo of Rashaun with the exact facial hair and haircut that Paul Connor says he has. So he also says it's 90% because the facial hair is a little different than what he saw that day. Not the facial features, not the person, that the beard was a little different. Now, Bryan's roommate, Dwayne, who he referred to as Cat, was on his way home from practice too. He's a little behind Bryan. He stopped for gas, but he's not much behind Bryan. When he gets there, he calls 911. At the time, these were recorded on cassette tapes still by the Miami-Dade Police Department, the 911 dispatch operators. Bryan's girlfriend comes down the stairs. Dwayne is so distraught he can't even remember. He just knows that she must have been there, heard the call. His own voice, he doesn't remember making it. But it's his voice, his call. He pulls up. You can see in the crime scene photos that he doesn't even pull into his parking spot. I submit to you that's because Jada was downstairs screaming, and he gets out of his car, and they both find Bryan laying behind the bush. Everything can happen in a split second. So while they are there, while Dwayne is there, while Jada's there, they're calling the police. Police are starting to respond. Word is getting out to the University of Miami football players. Dwayne has called Bryan's family. The word is spreading. Word spreads fast. These are teammates. But you heard Juan Navarro testify that he was in a coaches meeting. So everything is just happening, one thing right after the other. Practice ends, coaches meeting. Coaches are still in that meeting. In that meeting, they're notified that Bryan Pata has been shot. And they start heading to the crime scene. So everything starts to get in motion for what is happening that night and how they're handling the situation. So 6:41 to 7:39. 7:40 p.m. Bruce Johnson calls the defendant to tell him he needs to come back to the Heck Center. Bruce, I want to remind you, Bruce is one of the defendant's best friends. They're calling their position groups, and this is how they notify everyone to come back. He told him he needed to come back. Okay, all right. Not, I'm not coming. I was kicked off the team. I don't want to be there. Nothing else like that. But they talk again 2 minutes later. They talk again 6 minutes after the first call. Again, 9 minutes after the first call. They're talking a lot. And right after Bruce has now told the defendant, and you heard it from Bruce's mouth, Bryan Pata's been either shot or murdered. I'm not sure what they knew right at that second. You need to get back here. Who does Rashaun call? He calls Sherry with *67, a blocked number. He calls her at 7:43. This is about 43 minutes after Bryan has been found by Dwayne and Jada. And you can listen to the 911 call and get that exact time of when they called the police. 43 minutes later, he talks to Sherry. Remember that, because I want you to think back to Sherry's testimony. Sherry was sitting up here saying she's frantic because she can't reach Rashaun. Where is he? Is he hurt? This is only minutes after the word is getting out to the football team. The word is getting out to the community that Bryan Pata's been murdered. Minutes later, minutes after a teammate gets a call. You think that the teammates are already calling Sherry? Use your common sense. It's not like they were called the second that Dwayne called the police. And he called from he blocked the phone number. Why would you call your girlfriend from a blocked number? Now, cell sites were not very prevalent back then. People didn't know exactly phone records. We weren't getting phone records for everything. You get call logs. If you looked at someone's cell phone, you wouldn't know who called them. If that's what you're thinking, not thinking phone companies keep records. Or maybe you do know that the phone companies keep records. You pull up your bill online and see who you called. But you think, if I block the call, no one's going to know. No one's going to know who I called. So that call between Sherry and the defendant is from a blocked number. And they don't talk again till 8:26. And then look at all of this later in the night. Two people who aren't talking, who are frantic, are talking continuously. The records speak for themselves. And in between, he's talking to Bruce again. But I think most importantly, Bruce knew that Rashaun had been suspended. This is one of his best friends, of course. I'm not going to be at practice. I've been suspended again. I messed up. And then he's calling him after practice. Called him about Bryan. Now he's calling him at 9:13 during the team meeting. Rashaun's the only one not there. Bruce tells you. It is undisputed. Everyone at that meeting tells you that the defendant was the only player not there. Some of them just noticed he wasn't there. Some of them, defendant can't say anyone else wasn't there. And Chief Hudak took the stand and told you that Rashaun, attendance had been taken, and Rashaun was the only one not there. The coaches noticed. So initially, you're noticing because from a coach perspective, we want to make sure all the players are accounted for. We want to make sure that they have counseling. We want to make sure they're safe. So the coaches do notice. This isn't just some random detail. And then the players notice. You sit with your position group. He wasn't there. So the coincidences start to build up. And that is something the police recognized from the beginning. So you heard from the officers in the case. As a homicide, the 911 call goes out, officers are dispatched to the scene. You heard from now Sergeant Perua, who was a new officer at the time. This was his first homicide. They're not a lot in Kendall, so they bring in all the training units. There were a lot of officers there. Not because of who was murdered, but just because as a training mechanism, they all respond. So he responds to the scene, he remembers the scene. And they treat this as they do every scene. You secure the scene, you secure the evidence, you separate the witnesses. Homicide responds. Homicide does area canvasses. They want to see if there's anyone who knows anything. They want to see if there's any video. They want to spread out. They want to look for casings. And they did. And there were no casings found at this scene. And what else does homicide want to do? They want to interview everyone while their memories are fresh. So Sergeant Hatz has told you he was new at homicide at the time, and he responded to the scene, and then he was told to respond to the HEC Center, the University of Miami Athletic Center, where the football players as well as other athletes train. So he goes there. Lieutenant Hellman told you he goes there, and their purpose is to interview players, start interviewing people that night, anyone with knowledge. Now, can they interview all 105 players on the team that night? No, they would have been there for days, especially just a couple of them. But Coach Kolker, in the meeting, anyone with anything thinks they may know anything, let's start with those players who might know something and bring them to this attention. So they start interviewing players. They coordinate to be able to go through the whole football team over the coming days and weeks. Now, while they're there, what happens? Once again, let's look at the phone records. Mike Sanders has a good friend on the football team, Khalil Jones. He was with him that night. They were on their way to dinner when his roommate, or friend, Khalil gets a phone call saying that Bryan was shot and they all need to go back to the HEC Center. So they go back to the HEC Center, Khalil goes to the meeting. Mike Sanders told you he was on the baseball team. He's an athlete, he's not a football player. So while he goes back to Khalil's apartment on the other side of campus, and he's watching news footage of what's happening. 22:04, 10:04, the defendant calls Mike Sanders. The other football players are at the HEC Center in a meeting, and the defendant chooses to call Mike Sanders asking him for money. Think about that timing. Mike doesn't remember him ever asking for money before. Also, Mike's sitting there, thinks this is strange, and what does he do? He thinks this is so strange that he immediately takes himself and goes to the HEC Center. There's a second call at 10:25. Mike doesn't remember making that call, but that's now Mike calling the defendant back. I submit to you that he's now at the HEC Center. He goes, he speaks to Coach Kolker. Coach Kolker says, oh, let's speak to the police. And then he speaks to Lieutenant Hellman. And he tells Lieutenant Hellman that he just...
That's not an evidence?
Oh. He speaks to Hellman, not Hatzis, right? Oh, yeah. Okay, sorry. Yeah, he speaks to Lieutenant Hellman. And Lieutenant Hellman sat here and told you that he spoke to Mike Sanders. So Mike Sanders immediately speaks to the coaches, speaks to the police, tells them that Rashaun, the defendant, has called him and asked for money. Money at a time shortly after Bryan Pata's death, while the rest of the players are all in a team meeting. Someone he has not asked for money before. And the records confirm this. And I'll come back to the defendant's statement, but think about what the defendant said to Detective Segovia. Mike Sanders, I barely remember Mike Sanders. It would be a lie if Mike Sanders said I called him asking for money. Mike Sanders went immediately after that phone call and reported it. Now, let's talk about Sherry Abramson, the defendant's girlfriend, who cared about him so much, she bought a car in his name, got a cell phone that afternoon, registered to her house, and someone in 2007, the defendant didn't want to talk to the police without him being present. Now, think about this. Sherry was not a player. She was not friends with Bryan. Her connection to this investigation is the defendant. Sherry sat here and told you what she remembered from that night. The problem is, her phone records and Rashaun's phone records show she lied. They don't add up to what she told the police back in 2007, and they don't add up to what she told you here today. What did Sherry tell you? I just remind you what Sherry told you. Sherry told you that she was working at Pottery Barn. Okay, that part's consistent. There's a call from Pottery Barn. But as she's leaving work, she gets a call from one of the defendant's friends on the football team, Willie Cooper. Willie Cooper called her and said they were frantically looking for Rashaun and they couldn't reach them.
Objection. Facts not in evidence.
So let's look at that timing. And Sherry's records are in evidence too. She spoke to Rashaun at 7:43, right after Bruce made the phone call to come to the Heck Center. Right after Bruce told the defendant that Bryan Pata had been shot. How are all these people not able to reach him and are frantically calling in that short couple minute period of time? So she told you, she sits up here, she told you, she told the police, she's frantically calling coaches. And she does call a coach. She calls Coach Swayze.
Objection. Facts not in evidence. Mischaracterization of the evidence.
And she tells you that she calls Bruce's family, that she is just worried sick, but she's already spoken to him. She knew exactly where he was. She knew he was safe. So why is she so worried? Or why is she telling you that she's making all these phone calls and she doesn't know where he is? She also tells you she left Pottery Barn and she went back to Miami Beach where she lives. She got home sometime after 8:30, 8:39. That's consistent with her records. You heard from Sergeant Cremacini about the records on the beach. Now, what about Rashaun's records? She says that he came there shortly after too. And in his own statement, he says he went over to Sherry's right after, probably 8:39. He doesn't go to Miami Beach then. Also, if he's with Sherry, why are you calling someone so many times that you're with? I want you to think about that too. So these calls go into, he ends up, he's calling her 10:26, 10:34, 10:34, 10:34, 11:06, 11:15, 11:19, 11:41, 1:12, 1:14. When you're with someone, you're not calling them nonstop. Use your common sense. It doesn't add up. The statements, the evidence in front of you that doesn't add up comes from Sherry Abramson and the defendant's own mouth. What else did she tell tell the investigators? She told Detective Diaz that she was worried that the defendant was going to be blamed for this. Why is that her first thought? The defendant is going to be blamed for Bryan's murder. They were teammates. They weren't close, but so if they weren't close, and this isn't someone they really have issues with, why would you be blamed? Why would you be the one? This projectile came from Bryan Pata. Dr. Liu recovered this projectile, which George Hertel showed you, from Bryan Pata's head. George Hertel took the stand, and he told you how he had no weapon to match this to. If he did, he would be able to make a comparison. But what he was able to tell you about the possible weapons that fired this .38 caliber projectile, he told you in his opinion, his expert opinion, that it was from a revolver, likely, in his opinion, a .38. And there are a number of different firearms it could be, and a lot of them look the same. And why is it a .38 revolver? This is a lead projectile. It didn't have a jacket, it didn't have something on top. If this was fired from a semi-automatic firearm, it would leave residue over time. It would damage the gun. So this is the type of ammunition you buy for a revolver. The lands and grooves, and I think it's canulas, that are left on the projectile, the markings that are here, are consistent with that of a revolver. And he even showed you what one of the weapons would look like that matched these characteristics. Now think back to what Dave told you he saw in the defendant's own hands. That description, a short chamber, snub nose is what he called it, a black snub-nosed revolver. And he knew it was a revolver because he grew up watching Westerns with his brothers. He sees that gun in the dorms, and then later, years later, the defendant says, "Hey, big bro, I got a .38 on me." He's bragging about having a .38, which is consistent with what Dave Howell saw. And Kareem Brown was even confronted with, how did you know what he was talking about? He wears number 38. 38, and he has a .38. He knew because around the locker room, the defendant would brag about having a .38. So there was no mistake that he was talking about his firearm. Now let's go back to the defendant's statement. And you'll have a chance to take the evidence back and watch it. So the defendant told Detective Segovia that he had an up and down relationship with Bryan Pata, that it started with jealousy over females. So the main female there was Jada Brody, someone that the defendant had first dated and now was Bryan Pata's serious girlfriend. He told them that they had an altercation in the dorm, the altercation that you heard about from Dave Howell and Eric Moncourt. So altercation consistent. They had issues. They had issues over Jada. You heard from all the players on the team. What were the issues between them? They didn't like each other. Yes, they could play as teammates, but the underlying simmering issue was over girls, over a girl. The girl that Bryan had. Now, the defendant says he didn't own a gun. But this is something that's dating back to 2004, where he is threatening Bryan Pata to go clip up with a gun. He is then later showing Dave Howell a gun. And later after that, he's bragging about this .38 to Kareem. I submit to you, he had a gun. He had a gun in college, and the gun he had is the same one he used to kill Bryan Pata. He remembers November 7th. That makes sense. You'd remember one of the worst days of your life. You test positive, your future's unsure. You think that you're going to make this football career work, but you keep messing up. You don't have the girl. You're going to get kicked off the team. You can't play in games. You're already not starting. Things are not going your way. And then it all just boils over. And he made a mistake. But that mistake was fatal to Bryan Pata. The defendant tells you in his statement, tells Detective Segovia, that Bruce called after practice to say that Bryan was dead. That phone call that we have here at 6:34. Or sorry, I'm pointing the wrong one. Sorry, 7:40. 6:34 was when practice got over. He told him he had a mandatory meeting. So Rashaun tells you he knew he had this mandatory meeting, and then he spoke to Sherry. Guess what? It's consistent with his records, but it's not consistent with Sherry. And then he went to Sherry's house at 8:30 or 9. He didn't speak to anyone else other than Bruce or Sherry. The green. Do you remember the green that Sergeant Cremacini just highlighted? That's his home. The people he didn't want to disappoint. The people he told Detective Segovia he didn't want to have his number. And he told you that he barely remembers Mike Sanders. And that it would be a lie if he called him to ask him for money. Sherry had money. Sherry was already paying for things. But he called Mike Sanders. Detective Segovia also gave him an out. He asked him if he was in the area. Maybe he went for a run to clear his head. He wasn't at practice, and he just wanted to clear his head from the bad day he had. He told him no, he hadn't done that. He couldn't provide any reason why Paul Connor would have seen him. Right outside of where Bryan's body was. The judge is going to read you some instructions at the end of closing. So one of these instructions is on eyewitness identification. So one of the things you consider is the capacity and opportunity of the witness to observe the offender based on the length of time, the conditions, lighting, and distance. These are two people who crossed each other on a sidewalk with streetlights. Whether the identification was the product of the eyewitness's own recollection or was the result of influence or suggestiveness. This is the second lineup Paul Connor was shown. The first lineup, he takes his time, looks at it and says, no, I don't recognize anyone. Second lineup, he gets to the defendant's picture and stops. He continues to look at the rest and then tells Detective Segovia and Detective Dominguez that that's the person he saw. Now, you're also taking into account the circumstances under which the defendant was presented to the eyewitness. Detective Segovia testified to that. Paul Connor was in his house and they presented him with the lineup. There are no inconsistent identifications. Any instance in which the eyewitness did not make an identification when given the opportunity to do so, that's referring to if he'd been shown multiple lineups with Rashaun's picture, with the defendant's picture. He was not. This is the only time. And the first time he immediately IDs him and he still remembers that years later. The witness's familiarity with the subject. You heard from Detective Segovia. He went and pulled Paul Connor's class schedule at the University of Miami. We looked at Rashaun's transcript to see exactly which professors he took. He did not take his class. This is not someone whose class he took. Rashaun Jones is not a starting football player. There are 100 players on the University of Miami football team. We have their names, their stats, their photos. There's no evidence that he knew who Rashaun was. He wasn't a starter. This isn't someone who was born and raised in Miami, where the University of Miami was their favorite football team. They have every single number memorized. This is someone from out of state who worked there for a couple years, didn't go to football games, sees them on TV, wearing, football players dressed in their helmets. This isn't the quarterback where the TV zooms in on them, mainly on the sidelines. Not a star player. This is not Bryan Pata. It's not Kareem Brown. Dwayne Hendricks. Not someone going the pros. This is not someone he knew. This is someone he recognized from crossing paths that night and stuck out in his memory, because that very next day, He realizes the importance of what he saw. So you can go through, and there are a couple others on here as well, whether the lapse of time, whether they're of different races, and the totality of the circumstances. You'll also be given the instruction for second-degree murder. So as we went over in jury selection, the state has elements that the state has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. One, Bryan Pata is dead. Dr. Liu testified and told you how he died. A single gunshot wound to the head incapacitated him, and he immediately fell there on the ground. The death was caused by the criminal act of Rashaun Jones. That criminal act is the act of pulling the trigger, of shooting him. 3, the third element, there was an unlawful killing of Bryan Pata by an act imminently dangerous to another and demonstrating a depraved mind without regard for human life. So what is a depraved mind? And what is an act that is imminently dangerous? So an act that is imminently dangerous to another and demonstrating a depraved mind is an act or a series of acts that a person of ordinary judgment would know is reasonably certain to kill. So I submit to you, pulling the trigger and shooting someone in the head is an act that's reasonably certain to kill them or do serious bodily injury, and is done from ill will, hatred, spite, or evil intent. So that ill will, hatred, spite, and evil intent had been boiling. It had been simmering under the surface for 2 years, over 2 years. And that act is of such a nature that the act itself indicates an indifference to human life. Shooting someone is an indifference to human life. But that ill will, hatred, spite, evil intent, that's what has been simmering under the surface. Bryan has everything that the defendant wants, and he chooses to let jealousy overtake him and kill Bryan Pata. We talked a little bit about puzzles. And how the state is going to prove everything together beyond a reasonable doubt. So you're also going to be read an instruction on reasonable doubt. Now, the judge will read this to you. It is proof beyond a reasonable doubt does not mean proof beyond all doubt. How do you have all doubt? If you see something with your own eyes. So, not proof beyond all doubt. A reasonable doubt, though, is not a mere possible doubt, a speculative, imaginary, or forced doubt. Could have, maybe was something different. That's not reasonable. That's not a reasonable doubt. So, such a doubt must not influence you to return a verdict of not guilty if you have an abiding conviction of guilt. Everything in this case adds up and points to the defendant. On the other hand, if after carefully considering, comparing, and weighing all the evidence, there is not an abiding conviction of guilt, or if having one, it's one which wavers and vacillates, it's not proof beyond every reasonable doubt, and you find the defendant not guilty because it's reasonable. So, a reasonable doubt is not any doubt. We don't have all doubt. So let's go back through those pieces of the puzzle that show the defendant's guilty. Starting in 2004, he threatens Bryan Pata and tells him to clip up. The issues, Bryan starts dating Jada. They were celebrating their 1-year anniversary the night before Bryan was killed. Now you heard that once Bryan is dating Jada, that she's the constant source of tension between them. This hadn't gone away.
Objection, this characterization of the testimony facts, not an ethical.
The issues they have with each other. They don't talk to each other. Anything that gets between them, the locker room knows. Their friends know. It's over Jada. All the players mentioned this. Everyone who testified, they knew this. And Dave told you he actually saw that. So Dave sees the fight in the dorm room, and then Dave sees another instance where Jada comes to tell Bryan something Rashaun's done, and they go at it and get into a fight. So that's later. This is ongoing. This is leading all the way up. And you heard that even in November, there were still, October, just before, this happens November 7th, that there are still issues between Rashaun and Bryan over Jada. So these haven't stopped. This isn't something far in the past. It's ongoing the whole time. The defendant had a gun. He had a .38 caliber gun, the same caliber that was used to kill Bryan. And a revolver doesn't leave casings, and there were no casings found at the scene. The defendant is the only one who wasn't at that meeting. And while he's at the meeting, he's calling Mike Sanders and asking for money. It's odd. He hadn't asked before. Defense stood up here in openings
Characterization of the testimony.
and told you that he's college broke. College broke, a girlfriend who pays for a cell phone, car, but he's on a full scholarship, athletic scholarship to University of Miami, room, board, tuition, girlfriend paying for extra stuff, and he's calling this other guy asking for money during the mandatory team meeting that he's the only one who's not there. And then you have his phone records. Take your time. Go through them. See why they don't add up. Why is he calling? Ask yourself, why is he calling his girlfriend from a blocked number? Why is his girlfriend calling him back and blocking her number? Why are there calls with Sherry when Sherry is frantically looking for him? Why is he not at her apartment when he says he's at her apartment and she says he's at his apartment? Why are they not concerned over his teammate who's been shot, but rather, oh, my future at the University of Miami? Yeah, you may start the day where that's the worst thing that happened to you, but now someone's dead. It's not a concern to them. And then, the last piece of the puzzle that he can't explain, Paul Connor sees him leaving the scene of the crime seconds. And we know it's seconds because we know that we had 48 seconds from the time that car was locked for this to happen, and Paul Connor sees him crossing paths after he's murdered Bryan and walks in and the lights are still on. So we know how close in time the defendant is to there. And he cannot explain why he's there.
Objection, burden shifting.
Detective Segovia asked him multiple times. Any reason? No? Okay. The defense wants you to believe that the defendant is the unluckiest person alive. That all the evidence in the case, the detectives interviewed over 150 witnesses. They speak to the entire football team. They speak to girlfriends. They speak to friends in the dorm. They speak to family members. They follow up on leads. They fly across the country. They're interviewing former teammates. They're following up on other leads. They're getting tips from psychics. They are following up on everything. And what happens? Every detail keeps coming back to the defendant. There is no statute of limitations for homicide. It is not a reasonable doubt if you say the defendant is guilty. He's the one who killed Bryan Pata, but he wasn't arrested for 15 years. That is not a reasonable doubt. That is not something that you can take into consideration. The question is, has the state proved the elements of the crime beyond a reasonable doubt? So if you are thinking of time, set that aside. That is not a reasonable doubt. Everything adds up to one individual, and that is the defendant. So at the end, you'll be provided with a verdict form. You should check the box. The defendant is guilty of second-degree murder. Then you must go down and answer some additional questions. Did the defendant actually possess a firearm in the course of committing the second-degree murder? You should answer yes. Did he discharge a firearm in the course of committing it? Yes. And did the discharge cause death? You should check the box yes. There is only one verdict that makes sense, and that is that the defendant, Rashaun Jones, is guilty of the homicide of Bryan Pata.
May I proceed, Judge?
Yes.
Members of the jury, the first thing that Ms. Alvarez told you whenever she got up here and spoke to you in her opening statement was that two things can be true at once. And that remains true now like it was then. The death of Bryan Pata was an absolute tragedy. Rashaun Jones is not responsible. That's what the evidence in this case has shown. The government has tried to take innocent facts that do not equal murder, and build it up and turn it into something that it was not. We sit here today in court 20 years later as they try to take information that they've had and put it in an order where it makes sense. And they've failed. They have not met their burden because they cannot meet their burden. What happened on November 7th of 2006? The government's evidence hasn't shown what happened. Nobody knows what happened to Bryan Pata on November 7th of 2006. But we know what did not happen. Rashaun Jones was not at the Colony Apartments. Rashaun Jones did not shoot him. Rashaun Jones had nothing to do with his death. Rashaun Jones failed a drug test. He went home. He was at home at the time that Bryan Pata was killed. And then he didn't go to the meeting. He didn't go to the team meeting because he was suspended. He didn't want to be around the team that he had just got suspended from. He was embarrassed. He didn't want to be around it, and he chose not to go. There wasn't a coach that called him to tell him he had to be there. Bruce Johnson called him to tell him about the meeting, and he made the decision not to go. And because he didn't go to that meeting, we're here. That one choice has snowballed out of control to where an arrest hadn't been made in 15 years, and all of a sudden now, we go back. We look at the one person who didn't go to that meeting for a completely innocent reason and try to paint this picture, try to use all of these innocent facts to turn it into a murder. The law does not permit that. The evidence in this case has not proven beyond and to the exclusion of every single reasonable doubt that Mr. Jones is responsible. And the evidence has not met that burden because it cannot meet that burden, because Rashaun Jones is innocent. And in a minute, you're going to hear some instructions from Judge Miranda. She's going to tell you about the burden that has to be met in this case. And Ms. Jones-Peabody spoke about it a little bit whenever she was talking to you in voir dire. It has to be an abiding conviction, something that sticks with you today, tomorrow, next week, next month, next year. Something to where you lay your head on that pillow, you feel comfortable with your decision. You're not wondering. You're not wondering about, doesn't come back. You don't think about it. That's not what the evidence in this case has done. And I want to talk about the evidence in this case. I want to get directly into it, and I want to start with Paul Connor. Paul Connor, you heard his testimony played over a video. He was shown a lineup. He selected Rashaun Jones' photograph out of that. But let's talk about the actual interaction between Paul Connor and this person that he saw. Paul Connor testified that he saw this person for 1 to 2 seconds. Paul Connor testified that his vision is 20/40 without his glasses on and 20/30 with his glasses on. Paul Connor testified that he could not say whether or not he actually was wearing his glasses at the time. Paul Connor testified that his vision is so bad it falls below the requirements to drive in Florida unless there's a special designation on his license saying he has to wear his glasses to be able to drive. Paul Connor said that he is nearsighted and he's farsighted. He has to wear glasses for distance and he has to wear reading glasses up close. Paul Connor told you that when he observed this person, they were walking past each other. Again, 1 to 2 seconds of interaction. Paul Connor testified that this occurred at night. Paul Connor testified that there are no streetlights on 77th Avenue. Paul Connor testified that he was shown some photographs in his testimony. He was asked where it was whenever he observed this person, and he pointed here, right near the entrance of the Colony Apartments. And now the government wants to talk about these lights way back here at this other entrance for this other apartment complex, but Paul Connor makes it very, very clear that this is where he was when he observed this person, and then he walks into the parking lot, and the person walks past him. That's where he observes him, right there in the Colony Apartments, not near those lights. There's no shopping center across the street. We see that on this map, the map that the government has shown. This is the apartment complex. This is the shopping center on 88th Street. This is, Detective Segovia said 1 block, but we're talking 1 block, 2 block, at least 2.5 blocks up. That's not illuminating this area. You can see how dark it is on some of the crime scene photographs as well. This is a photograph. I'm showing you State's Exhibit 13. A photograph showing horizontally, parallel with that entrance. You don't see a single light here. Detective Patz has told you that these photographs were taken with a flash. The only light that you see in this photograph is a flash. And then we see this picture, also State's Exhibit 13. This is a parking lot facing the entrance. You see how dark this is, and there's this one globe light. The only light there at that entrance. And what did Dwayne Hendricks say about this one globe light? Well, first of all, in his 911 call, he says, "It's black out here. I can't see anything. It's black out here. I can't see anything." And then when the government got back up to ask him questions during his redirect examination, they wanted to try and establish that the area where he was dark, but the parking lot was well lit. And what did he say? There was one light by the entrance. It was supposed to be well lit, but it wasn't. That was his exact testimony. It was supposed to be well lit, but it wasn't. This was a dark area, and he observed this person for 1 to 2 seconds without his glasses on, and he has 20/40 vision. Ultimately, during Paul Connor's testimony, he admits everything. He says, the question is, so you saw this person for 1 to 2 seconds without your glasses on, and it was dark outside. He says, yes, yes, yes. Not only that, not only were the conditions that he saw this person in bad, not good for a reasonable, reliable identification. And that's one of the things that you are going to be instructed. You're going to be instructed to consider certain factors when you're determining the credibility of an eyewitness identification or selection. And one of them is the capacity and the opportunity of the eyewitness to observe the offender based on the length of time of observation and conditions at the time of observation, including lighting and distance. So all of those factors I just discussed, you're going to be specifically instructed to consider those. Not only that, not only were the conditions poor, but the time between whenever he saw this person and the actual being shown the lineup was 7.5 months. 7.5 months. Members of the jury, if you saw a person for 1 to 2 seconds at night and you were asked to accurately pick a photograph of them 7.5 months later, would you be able to do it? Would you be able to do that? Especially when Paul Connor says that he didn't think anything of it at the time. He didn't realize anything was wrong until the next day. Later in the afternoon that day, whenever he gets to his office and sees the news. That's the first time he realized anything was happening. So he crosses paths with this person at night without his glasses on for 1 to 2 seconds. Isn't anything that sticks out in his mind. It's not something that he immediately thought was something that he should remember. But then 7.5 months, he's able to accurately pick this person out of an identification? No. Nobody could do that. Another factor that you're going to be instructed to consider is whether the identification, the selection was cross-racial. Whether the person selected and the witness are of different races. Why? Because it's difficult to identify someone of a different race. That's what the science has shown. That's what the law says. Paul Connor.
As to the science move to strike.
Okay, sustained. As to the science comment, please disregard.
The law asked you to consider it. There's a reason that the law asked you to consider the races of the two individuals and whether it's cross-racial. There's a reason for that. Paul Connor is a white man from Kentucky who's been in Miami for 3 years, and Rashaun Jones is a black male. That's something that you're going to be instructed to consider. You're also going to be instructed to consider whether the identification was the product of the eyewitness's own recollection or was the result of influence or suggestiveness. What you heard about the lineup and the administration of that lineup in 2007 was that Detective Dominguez was aware of who the individuals in that lineup were. That lineup isn't recorded. The procedure is not recorded. We don't know what was said. We don't know what was done. We don't know what body language was used by Detective Dominguez. We don't know if there was anything that might have suggested the identity of the person in that lineup. Let's also take a look at the lineup that included Mr. Jones and compare it with the lineup that included the other individual, the other suspect. Do we see a difference between these two lineups? Do we see a difference in the lighting and the quality of the pictures and the details that you can see in this one versus the one that included Rashaun Jones? Rashaun Jones' picture in this lineup is a black blur. There's a shadow around his chin. There's a shadow around the sides of his face. You can barely see any of the facial details. There's a dark background that sticks out. His background is darker than the background of the other individuals in these photographs. He's the darkest one. He stands out because of the background and because of the quality of that picture. That's suggestive in and of itself. Plus, we don't know what was said by Detective Dominguez or done by Detective Dominguez whenever he showed that to him. You heard testimony that the way they do it now is single pieces of paper. One piece of paper for each photograph. Detective Segovia testified that sometimes the photographs are larger, sometimes the photographs aren't larger, but they're each printed on their own individual piece of paper. How accurate can you be about someone's identity when you're looking at a 1-inch by 1-inch photograph of their blurry face in a shadow? You can't be. You're also, under the current procedures today, looking at one person at a time. So you're not in a situation where you're looking at a group of people and trying to pick the one that closest resembles the person who you might remember that you saw 1 to 2 seconds at night without your glasses on 7 months ago. The lineup was done improperly. There was also a moment, and I think this will draw a distinction between proper and improper, between something that makes sense and something that doesn't. During Paul Connor's testimony, he's asked by the prosecutor to step down and stand in front of him and ask if he can see him clearly. What's the difference? And he says yes. What's the difference between that and the lineup and the interaction that he had with this person who ran past him or walked past him, depending on which version of his testimony you're considering? Well, the prosecutor, white male. Paul Connor, white male. They're also standing still across from each other. They're not moving. They're not walking past each other. It's in a well-lit courtroom. It's not nighttime. Paul Connor's paying attention. Paul Connor's looking him in the face. He's being asked to look directly at him in the face and say whether or not he can see him clearly. He wasn't asked to pay attention to this person who walked past him. He said he didn't even think anything of it until the next day. Another thing Paul Connor said was clean white smile. Very clear about clean white smile during his testimony. This person appeared pleasant to him and smiled at him, and he had a clean white smile. You heard from Bruce Johnson. He described Rashaun Jones' teeth in 2006 as jagged, and he said they had some color on them. And he was asked whether or not he would describe it as a clean white smile, and Bruce Johnson said no, absolutely not. His teeth were jagged, and they had color on them, not a clean white smile. That's the main thing that that's the main thing that Paul Connor recalls was this clean white smile. That is not Rashaun Jones based on the evidence that you heard during this case. Another factor that you're going to be instructed to consider is witness familiarity with the subject identified. Now, there's this concept of subconscious transference. We've all been in a situation where someone looks familiar to us. We feel like we may have seen this.
Objection, Judge. Sustained.
Sometimes we misremember where we've seen people. If someone's face looks familiar to us, we might think they're from one place, we might think they're from work or some interaction, but they're actually from another place. You see a person's face who might be an actor or something like that. You might think you saw them in one movie, but then it turns out to be something else. You can misapply where you've seen people and the situation. You can get it wrong. What do we know about Paul Connor? Where could he have possibly seen Rashaun Jones' face before without actually realizing it? With being in one of those situations where someone's face looks familiar, but he gets the timing wrong, gets the situation wrong, gets the context wrong. Paul Connor said he's a University of Miami football fan. Rashaun Jones was on the football team. Now, the government says he wasn't a starter. He wasn't a starter. But let's think about that. If Rashaun Jones wasn't starting the majority of the time on the football team, he would be on the sideline. If he's on the sideline, he would have his helmet off. If he has his helmet off and someone's watching the football game, Paul Connor said he used his glasses when he watched the football game in his testimony because he could see better whenever he had his glasses on. You could see their face more clearly. Maybe he saw Rashaun Jones' face on the sideline at one of those football games. Paul Connor also testified that he used to look at ESPN roster photos of the football team to see if he had any football players in his classes. We know that he then saw Rashaun's roster picture. We know that he's seen it. Paul Connor was a professor at the University of Miami from 2004 to 2007. Rashaun Jones was a student and an athlete at the University of Miami from 2004 to 2007. The same period of time, 3 years. Detective Segovia told you he pulled the class schedule, he pulled the teaching schedule and Rashaun's schedule, and they were never in the same class. First of all, are either of those pieces in evidence? Are you going to trust Detective Segovia's word for that? Second of all, just because they were not in the same class doesn't mean that they didn't cross paths at the university. Detective Segovia told you that he didn't see which building Paul Connor was teaching in. He didn't see which building Rashaun had classes in. He's not sure if Paul Connor taught a class in the same building that Rashaun was taking a class with another professor. He told you he's not sure if they might have crossed paths in that building. He told you he's not sure if they might have crossed paths on their way to and from courses that Paul Connor was teaching and that Rashaun was taking. Paul Connor testified that he eats lunch in the cafeteria with the students. He mingles with the students in the cafeteria. Subconscious transference. He could have seen Rashaun.
Sustained. To strike.
He could have seen Rashaun Jones' face at any one of those points and misremembered the context. When asked to identify a person and put with a lineup in front of them, he recognizes a face but misremembers where he recognized that face from. And 7.5 months after he encountered this individual for 1 to 2 seconds without his glasses at night, he made a mistake. He made a mistake. How many football games were between November of 2007 and November of 2006 and June of 2007, whenever Paul Connor made that selection in that lineup? How many football games had Paul Connor watched? How many times had him and Rashaun Jones crossed paths on the University of Miami campus? You heard testimony that after Rashaun finished his 2-game suspension, he came back. He came back to the football team. He was back on campus the next day. Let's talk about this 2020 situation where Detective Segovia talks to Paul Connor and says, hey, look at the same exact lineup that you previously saw with the people in the same exact position and tell me if you can remember making the selection. Didn't change the position, didn't change the pictures, didn't use the department's new policy of putting them on a single piece of paper each and showing them separately. Showed them the same exact picture and just said, hey, do you remember this? When you're considering the factors for whether or not it's reliable, is that suggestive? Showing him the same exact set of pictures in the same exact position? 20 years later, 15 years later. And then Paul Connor testified. You heard him testify. The defense attorney asked him a question. You remembered the position of the picture you selected. And he said, if I have to be honest, then yes, I remembered the location of the picture. He was specifically asked, I wrote it down. When the detective showed you this new lineup in 2020, was Mr. Jones, where was Mr. Jones' location? It's the same. And your testimony, as you recall Mr. Jones being in the second position at the top, answer, I would have to be truthful and say yes. He remembered the position, the same exact lineup that he had seen. No change. Didn't take the time to create a new lineup with the new procedures, administer it again, give the warnings that he testified about, none of that. There's a reason why Paul Connor selected Mr. Jones' picture June 24th of 2007 and nobody made an arrest. The officers knew that this was unreliable, that this was not the type of lineup that you can put any sort of weight behind because of all the factors that we discussed. The government knew that this was not an identification, not a lineup that you can put any sort of weight behind. And it's not until 2020, after 15 years, when a new detective gets assigned to the case, all of a sudden now it becomes enough. It becomes credible. And then he shows him the same exact lineup again. Paul Connor's testimony also has a ton of conflicts in it. If you listen to his testimony, he testified that the reason he took the train that day was because his car was in the shop. Couldn't tell you what shop, couldn't tell you where the shop was, couldn't give you any details about the shop, but then also testified that the reason he found out that something had happened at the apartment complex that night was because he was driving his car out of the complex and saw police and police tape. And he's questioned about this. Well, could you be mistaken? Yes, I could be mistaken. His whole recollection is wrong. He's also misremembering when the police came and spoke to him. He's misremembering the date that's on the sketch that he did. He's certain that it was November 8th, but the sketch says November 9th. And let's talk about this sketch for a second. Does this look anything like Rashaun Jones? Does this look anything like Rashaun Jones? Nothing. Paul Connor's selection is not reliable. It is not credible. Paul Connor's selection should be taught in law schools and at police academies. It had every single mark of a false identification, every single indicator of a false.
Judge, move to strike.
Move to strike, but also state the objection, move on.
You'll be instructed to consider the factors when weighing eyewitness identifications and selections. Paul Connor's selection has issues in every single category. This was a misidentification, and everybody knew it until 2021. Let's talk about the other evidence in the case. All the evidence that is completely innocent information, completely innocent behaviors that now, 20 years later, the government's trying to spin into a motive, to try and spin into a murder. We spent days hearing about a dorm room fight in 2004. A fight that happened summer of 2004, so 2.5 years before the murder of Bryan Pata. 2.5 years. And the government's telling you that because a fight that happened 2.5 years before, Rashaun Jones went and shot him in the head because he failed a drug test? What did the witnesses who testified about that fight say? Eric Moncourt said Rashaun Jones didn't want to fight. Rashaun Jones wasn't the aggressor. He didn't want any sort of conflict with Bryan Pata. Eric Moncourt testified that he thought that everything was quashed after this. He didn't hear anything else about it. He didn't think that this was a continuing issue. He wasn't aware of any issues after this. Eric Moncourt testified that there's fights between players all the time. How many of the football players testified about the locker room dynamic and how there's fights in the locker room? It's not uncommon. It's a situation where there's a lot of alpha males, a lot of testosterone, a lot of competitive people, a lot of conflicting personalities. And this is something that happens in a locker room. There's fights. There's arguments. There's people who don't necessarily gel together, people who aren't on speaking terms, people who don't get along, people who don't hang out. And that's completely normal. Everybody testified to that. Kareem Brown testified that him and Bryan Pata used to get in arguments every single day. It's normal. There's fights. This is nothing out of the ordinary. This is a locker room dynamic for a Division I football team. A fight 2 years before is not motive. The Jada stuff. A bunch of testimony about how Rashaun and Jada might have had a thing at one point, sort of informal, and there was gossip about it. Everybody who testified about it said that there was nothing more going on once Jada and Bryan Pata started dating in fall of 2005. There might have been a conversation where Bryan Pata went and told Rashaun, hey, that's my girl now. And Rashaun said, yeah, all cool, that's fine. No issues, no further issues. There was no testimony that Rashaun was continuing to try and be with Jada or get with Jada. He had his own girlfriend in November of 2006, Sherry Abramson, who let him drive her Range Rover, and she drove a Maserati. She got him phones. She gave him money. What's he jealous for? He's not jealous. This was something in the past that, like he said in his statement, got blown out of proportion. It got exaggerated. Because when he didn't go to that meeting, when he chose not to go to that meeting because he had failed a drug test, he was down in the dumps, according to Bruce Johnson, didn't want to go. Now all of a sudden, the narratives start turning. This thing that happened 2 years ago starts coming up and gets blown out of proportion. The situation with Jada before Bryan and Jada started dating gets blown out of proportion. It gets spun up and spun up. And now people are testifying 20 years later, after hearing all the coverage in this case, after being called by ESPN to discuss this case and asked these types of questions. Now they're testifying 20 years later. It's snowballed. It's not motive for murder. It's not jealousy. The government's also arguing that Bryan Pata was going to be drafted to the NFL, which is another reason why Rashaun was jealous enough to kill him. And that Rashaun wasn't getting that much playing time, which is why Rashaun was jealous enough to kill him. How many people testified who were on that team who went to the NFL? That team was full of NFL players. This wasn't unique to Bryan Pata. He was a talented football player. He was going to get drafted, but it was not a unique situation. There were a lot of people who ended up in the NFL. Bruce Johnson, the person who was closest to Rashaun, went to the NFL. There's a lot of people who went to the NFL. Bryan and Rashaun didn't play the same position. It's not like they were competing for a starting job. It's not like Bryan Pata was the one who was keeping Rashaun from any playing time. Completely different positions. And all the players who came and testified told you about how the position groups ran together. The linemen were in one section of the locker room. The linemen hung out together. DBs, separated section of the locker room, far away. They hung out together. They were all in their own position groups. That's who they hung out with. There was no direct competition between Bryan and Rashaun Jones. Not the type of competition that can drive someone to commit a homicide. Let's break this down. The government's theory of prosecution in this case is that Rashaun Jones failed his second drug test. Not his first drug test, where this is the first time that this has happened and this is a new thing that he's dealing with. Not his third drug test, where he's now going to get kicked off the team. He failed his second drug test. And he misses some class sometimes. And he gets in trouble sometimes for being late to meetings. And he has such a break He's so upset that he failed his second drug test that he shoots his teammate in the head? Does that make any sense, members of the jury? Does that make any sense at all? Let's talk about the evidence surrounding the firearm, the projectile. The government is asking you to make so many leaps, so many jumps, to link this projectile to Rashaun Jones. First of all, you have to believe that the firearms analyst was accurate in saying that this is 100% a .38 caliber bullet. He testified that he took measurements. He testified that he didn't write the measurements down, couldn't tell you what the measurements were, but knows that, he took the measurements and it was consistent, but he couldn't tell you what they were. He talked about how damaged the bullet was and how he took measurements off of a damaged bullet, was able to say it was a .38 caliber. So first you have to believe that the projectile was a .38 caliber. Then the next leap that you have to take is that the murder weapon would have had to have been a .38 caliber. Because the firearms analyst, Mr. Hertel, testified that the fire weapon very well could have been a .357 firearm. Could have been a .357 revolver, could have been a .357 semi-automatic handgun, could have been a .357 rifle, could have been a .357 Derringer. So now you have to assume that all of those were not the murder weapon. Then you have to assume that David Howell is telling the truth. And let's talk about David Howell for a second. He testified that on the stand, Rashaun showed him a gun in Patricia Dunak's dorm room, in a friend's dorm room, right? And then when Detective Segovia was being questioned, he was asked about another statement that David Howell made when he said it happened in his dorm room. So he has the places different. David Howell was also very close with Eric Moncourt. Eric Moncourt told you how close him and David Howell were. They were both linemen, and they ran around in the same group. They spoke almost every day, he said. Eric Moncourt said he never heard anything, ever, never heard anything at all, ever, about Rashaun Jones having a gun. Never heard anything about it. David Howell didn't mention it one time. And while we're here, let's talk about these locker room rumors that nobody was able to directly testify about, just a couple witnesses, Kareem Brown and David Howell, talking about the rumors. How is it a rumor if Eric Moncourt never heard anything about a firearm? How is it a rumor if Bruce Johnson never heard anything about a firearm? How is it a rumor if Dwayne Hendricks didn't hear anything about a firearm? What did Dwayne Hendricks say when he was asked about Rashaun Jones? Rashaun Jones was always talking about girls. Rashaun Jones was always talking about girls. Didn't say anything about guns or firearms or anything like that. The only two witnesses in this case who say anything about Rashaun with a gun, which is directly contradicted by the other witnesses, both police officers now. They're both working with law enforcement. The only two witnesses who say anything about Rashaun having a gun, 20 years later. So David Howell said revolver, small caliber, could have been .38, could have been another small caliber. So now the next assumption we have to make to link this projectile to Rashaun Jones is that what David Howell saw, if he's telling the truth, was a .38 caliber. And then we have to assume that the .38 caliber David Howell saw, if he's telling the truth, was one of the brands of .38 caliber that Hertel talked about, because there were specific brands listed. And then we have to take another assumption that says not only was it one of those brands, but it was the exact gun that was used in the homicide. We're 5 layers removed from the actual evidence in this case, the actual projectile, and anything to do with Rashaun Jones. And that's assuming that you find that the witnesses who testified about this are credible. Kareem Brown, the other witness besides David Howell, who says anything about Rashaun and firearms. He says they're at practice or a team-related event, and Rashaun Jones comes up to him, even though they've never had a one-to-one conversation ever. Kareem Brown testified. They've never.
Judge Fox on evidence.
All right. Overall, you can continue.
Kareem Brown testified, that him and Rashaun Jones had never had a one-on-one conversation. They'd never spoken one-to-one. They're in different positions, different groups. They don't hang out. But all of a sudden, Rashaun Jones walks up to him after practice one day or after a team event and says, "Hey, big bruh, I got that .38 on me." Does that make any sense? Does that make any sense at all? Somebody you've never spoken to ever, you're going to tell them, I got a gun on me? That makes no sense. Also, if they're coming back from practice, he obviously wouldn't have had a gun on him at practice. He might have had his jersey on him, which was number 38, if that statement even occurred. What else did Kareem Brown say while we're talking about him? He testified that the University of Miami is a relatively small community. It's small compared to some of these larger football schools. And the people who stay on campus, even smaller. And that the football players would commingle and intermingle with the same group of females who lived on campus. And it wasn't unusual for football players to have had relations in the past with the same girl. Again, not something that's unusual. Jada having a thing with Rashaun and then dating Bryan Pata, not something that's out of the ordinary, not something that's unheard of. Just like the fights. Just like the fact that they weren't necessarily best friends, they weren't on speaking terms, they didn't interact, they didn't hang out. All of this, completely normal for this locker room, for this team dynamic, and that's what the witnesses said. I also want to talk about this idea, going back to Paul Connor for a second, that the government has been trying to tell you about Rashaun Jones running from his apartment, running down, committing a homicide, running back up to his apartment. First of all, Detective Segovia testified, because he's the one who drew this line, about how Paul Connor told him he was sprinting between buildings. If you listen to Paul Connor's testimony, he's asked about this directly. He says, did you ever tell anybody that you saw this person sprinting between buildings? And Paul Connor says, I know that's in one of the reports, but I did not say that. I didn't say that. He denies ever saying that. That comes from Segovia. Paul Connor says that didn't happen. He says he turned around, saw his back for a second, never saw him turn and start running. So this is not based on Paul Connor's testimony. First of all. Second of all, Paul Connor said he didn't observe any sweat on this individual that he saw. But the government's trying to say that Rashaun Jones is in good shape. He's a football player, works out all the time. So he ran down, committed a murder, and then began leaving. And Paul Connor didn't see any sweat on this person? It doesn't make sense. It's a conflict in the evidence. Also, if Rashaun Jones was on that road in that area, going where Paul Connor says he saw this person go, Dwayne Hendricks is on his way back from practice as well. Dwayne Hendricks testifies he drives down that road and comes in. Dwayne Hendricks would have crossed paths with Rashaun Jones. Dwayne Hendricks would have recognized Rashaun Jones because he knows Rashaun Jones. Dwayne Hendricks didn't see Rashaun Jones anywhere that night. He didn't see him once, not when he's driving home. And the government keeps saying that Rashaun got this call from Bruce Johnson, so he knew practice was over. He knew when to go. Well, if he knew practice was over, he also knew that football players lived at the Colony Apartments. He knew that Dwayne Hendricks was Bryan Pata's roommate. He knew that they would be coming back at the same time. So he would decide to then go and commit a homicide in open public while he knows that other football players are going to be returning there because he knows that they live there. That doesn't make any sense. Let's talk about that phone call with Bruce Johnson. Bruce Johnson calls him before the death of Bryan Pata at 6:41. And then he speaks to him again at 7:40, at 7. 7:39. I remember. Bruce Johnson says he didn't notice anything unusual about that call. He didn't notice anything unusual about either of those calls. He didn't notice that he was out of breath. He didn't notice that he was panicked. He didn't notice that he was frantic. Nothing. He's known Rashaun Jones since Rashaun Jones and him played youth football together. If they're on a phone 39 minutes after Rashaun Jones had just committed a homicide, or 19 minutes before Rashaun Jones goes to commit a homicide, he would have noticed something off. He would have noticed that something wasn't right. He would have heard something in his voice. He would have known. But no, he says, no, nothing unusual. I told him about the meeting. I told him about it. Nothing unusual at all. In the call before, he told me about failing his drug test. I didn't notice anything unusual. At the very least, he would have heard that he was out of breath if he ran all the way there like the government's saying. Now after Rashaun Jones gets Pat Diaz, who comes and puts a card at his house. Rashaun Jones calls Pat Diaz, speaks to Pat Diaz, agrees to an interview with Pat Diaz, cooperates. Pat Diaz goes back to his house a second time, leaves a card. Again, Rashaun reaches out and makes contact, speaks to him. Pat Diaz says, why didn't you say anything about Jada last time? He's like, well, you didn't ask about Jada. But doesn't hide it. He has nothing to hide. Speaking to police. And then this third time, the government wants to make it seem like Rashaun Jones was trying to keep Sherry from saying anything to the police. But Sherry testified, and Sherry told you that she got this call, and Rashaun said, no, go speak to him, it's fine. And then when they get back, Rashaun makes a statement about how he doesn't want them speaking to her alone, protective boyfriend. But then when the detectives explain the situation to him, and the detectives say, like, no, we have to interview witnesses one at a time, we want to make sure it's one at a time, what did Pat Diaz say? He was cool with it. He had no issue. There was no issue. Once they explained it to him, there was no issue. He was cooperative with everything that he was asked to do. When he's taken into custody in 2021, he walks into that interview room. He's read his Miranda rights. He's told that you don't have to speak to me at all. The law says you do not have to speak to me. And he says, let's go. Let's speak. He was eager to speak with Detective Segovia. You hear that on the recording. He's eager to speak with him. And they do. They speak for 2 hours. And I know the government told you that Detective Segovia was trying to give him an out. Detective Segovia was trying to get him to give some sort of reasonable explanation for why he might have been in the area. Do not get it mistaken. He was under arrest. There was nothing that Rashaun Jones could have said to get him out of there. If he could have given an explanation for being on scene, and he did, he would have been in handcuffs. Again, he would have stayed in handcuffs. This wasn't a reasonable chance to explain anything. This was, let's see what we can get him to say. Rashaun Jones didn't take the bait. He didn't take the bait when Detective Segovia was trying to say, look, I'm trying to give you a chance. If there's a reason why you could be there, if there's a reason why you were in the area, maybe we can get you out of this. He didn't take it. He said, no, I wasn't there. I wasn't there. I wasn't there that night. I was at my house. Which is consistent with the phone records. Sergeant Cremasini testified about the cell site locations and the phone records. And he talked to you about 2 calls that ping off of this tower to sort of near the crime scene. And he said he can't exclude the possibility that Rashaun's phone would ping there from his house. But let's assume that it didn't. Between those 2 pings at 3:55 p.m. and 8:57 p.m., Sergeant Cremasini testified that all the calls were consistent with Rashaun Jones being at home. They were all pinging off of his home towers, the towers that are consistent with him sitting in his living room. That's what Sergeant Cremasini testified to. That directly supports what Rashaun Jones told the officers. I was at home. And every call made during that period of time is consistent. The cell tower information is consistent with him being at home. The government also wants to point at Rashaun Jones' statement that he gave 15 years later and try and be nitpicky about times and he said he called Bruce Johnson and then he called Sherry, but he also called a few people in between. He's being interviewed 15 years later. He remembers some conversations. Can't remember every single thing that he's being asked about. Can't remember every single detail of everything. He remembers the things that stand out to him. He remembers that he failed a drug test that day and he was suspended. He remembers that he didn't go to the team meeting because he was upset about failing the drug test and didn't want to be around those people. He remembers changing his phone number because, again, he didn't want people reaching out and nagging him. And he changes his phone number before the murder occurs. Why would somebody change their phone number, put their phone number in their name before a homicide if they were trying to conceal anything? That doesn't make any sense at all. Why you would change your phone number, get it put in your name as some sort of preparation to commit a crime? It doesn't make any sense. And Sherry testified that he was always changing his number. Sure, her parents owned Verizon stores. She was able to help him and get him phones. That doesn't make any sense why he would change his number. And then going back to the calls and the calling people, because the government argued that why is he calling all these people if he didn't want anybody bugging him? Well, before he learned about this death of Bryan Pata, he calls a select few people. He calls his friend, he calls his girlfriend, people who he wants to have his number. Probably people that he wants to confide in, people that he wants to talk to about the situation. That's who he calls. And then once he learns this information, then there's a number of calls that happen. But you can imagine, and when something like this happens, whenever your whole team is being affected by this situation, all the students are talking about it. There's students calling. Everybody's, calling back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. I also want to talk about this idea that Sherry lied to cover for Rashaun by telling officers that she wasn't able to get in touch with Rashaun around the time of the murder. If she was trying to cover for Rashaun, she wouldn't have said that, I don't know where he was at the time of the homicide. Right? That doesn't sound like something you would say when you cover for somebody. And then we know that they were on the phone. He speaks to Bruce Johnson, 7:40 something, and then him and Sherry have a conversation, 2 calls, and then at around 8:30 they have another phone call. They're in communication there. Now there are a number of calls that happened later that night. Maybe Sherry was confused about the timing. Maybe she did call him, but it wasn't around the time of the homicide. It was around the time where he was supposed to be coming to see her. She's wondering, what's taking you so long? So she calls him. And then whenever she's asked about this later, who knows how much longer later, she says, I was calling him a bunch. I was worried about him because another football player had got shot. I just learned that someone else was shot, so I was calling him. Later in the night, a few hours later, Rashaun also, whenever he testified, wasn't able to be 100% accurate about the times because it's 15 years later. Unrelated to the time of the homicide occurring or anything where she might have thought that Rashaun was going to get blamed for something. She doesn't remember making that statement 15 years later. Let's talk about the blocking of the numbers. So we see here, Rashaun uses star 67 to dial Sherry's number, but then 56 minutes later, she calls him at that number. So she had his number, she got his number. Were there any text messages that were going on at the time? Did the government get any text messages at the time? Did they see if anything was being discussed on text message, if he maybe texted her his number so that she would have it? We don't know why he blocked the number there. Who knows? There's 1,000 different reasons why he might have used star 67. I use star 67 for 1,000 different reasons. It doesn't mean murder. It doesn't equal murder, especially whenever she's calling him back. She has his contact information. It doesn't make sense. Again, these are innocent facts. When you look at them, it does not equal murder. And then 20 years later, the government's they talk about puzzles. They're trying to take a piece from this puzzle and a piece from that puzzle and a piece from this puzzle and jam them all together and put a picture together and try to tell you that this equals murder. It doesn't. These puzzle pieces do not fit together. There's not a single piece of direct, credible evidence that links Rashaun Jones to this homicide. Nothing. And the evidence that you heard during this trial about 2.5 years, the conflict, and nothing that's unusual based on the team dynamic, and the phone records that are consistent with him being at home during that entire time, it shows this is not the truth. What the government is trying to say is not the truth. Taking these different puzzle pieces from different puzzles and putting them together does not make a picture that proves this case beyond and to the exclusion of reasonable doubt. It does not. I might have mentioned this, but I'm going to say it again. When he changed his number, it was in his name, and then he was calling people, and they had his number. He's not trying to hide anything. And whenever he calls these detectives, right, because Pat Diaz said, we left a card, he got in touch with us. Was he calling them from his number that he changed? Was he hiding it? Was he hiding his number from police? Was he hiding it from investigators? No, he had nothing to hide from investigators at any point. Now, Mike Sanders asking for money. Why he was asking for money, the government really hasn't said. That he's trying to maybe have gotten a get out of town or something. He had a vehicle. The witnesses who testified that he had a vehicle that he could use to drive out of town if he wanted to. He had a girlfriend who did have money. So if Mike Sanders, said no for whatever reason, and then Sherry actually was trying to cover for him and he was trying to skip town, Sherry could have got him a bus ticket, a plane ticket, got him out of town. None of that. Mike Sanders' family owned KFC franchises. He testified that was known around the campus. People knew that his family was well off. He said he couldn't tell you whether or not Rashaun had asked for money before. He can't recall that. And he couldn't recall much. He couldn't recall the time where he called Rashaun back. Can't tell you what happened on that phone call. Can't tell you anything about what happened there. And context matters whenever we're talking about a witness and the government's trying to say that Rashaun calling and maybe asking for money is somehow evidence of murder. Context matters. How does he not remember that second phone call? The only thing he remembers about the first phone call is Rashaun called him and asked him for money. Doesn't remember anything else that was said on that phone call. Maybe Rashaun was embarrassed. Maybe Rashaun, his girlfriend Sherry, had just got him a new phone that day. She already helped him out enough. Maybe Rashaun was running out of money, was embarrassed to reach out to Sherry and ask for more help after she had already got him a phone, calls Mike Sanders. Not a single witness who testified in this trial could tell you anything about Rashaun Jones' financial situation. They couldn't tell you anything. Nothing. Nobody pulled his bank records. Nobody wanted to see what his balances were. None of it. We do know, at the very least, he was calling to check his account balance at star 225 to see how much money he had left on his account. So he had that issue. Called the 1-800 number. The bank. And this gap of time argument, where there's no phone calls made for 58 minutes. Sergeant Cremesini testified that whether the phone was on or off, there would have been records of calls coming in, whether it was on or off. All that means is that nobody called for that period of time. That's all that means. A gap in time doesn't mean that the phone was turned off, doesn't mean it was left at home, doesn't mean anything. It just means no calls were coming in. And then between 4:11 and 5:07, another 56-minute gap, there's no calls, no phone calls made. Nothing happened during that period of time. And Sergeant Cremesini was asked, how long have you been in the courtroom? Have you been here for, 56 minutes? By the time he left this courtroom, he had been here for 56 minutes. Just because you don't make a call or receive a call for 56 minutes, that doesn't mean that you're committing a crime, that you're killing someone. Again, another piece of innocent evidence that the government is trying to frame to piece all these misfit puzzle pieces together and create a murder. In 2020, when Detective Segovia took over this case, he selected the suspect and made the evidence fit. Painted a narrative of normal facts that are completely normal for everybody on that football team. Fights, hooking up with the same girls, not hanging out with everybody, maybe not gelling with somebody. And he took that and spun it into a narrative. And now we're here today, 20 years later, because that narrative got spun. 20 years later. How many detectives worked on this case between 2006 and 2020? I think there was testimony that there was dozens and dozens and dozens of detectives who worked on this case and investigated this case. For 20 years, 15 years, by 2021. And not a single one of them was smart enough to say, oh, you know what, it's Rashaun Jones. No, it was just when Detective Segovia got on the case and was tasked with reevaluating all the evidence and looking at everything like he was working it anew. That's what he testified about. He was the only person smart enough to crack this case after 15 years. The only one. Except for when asked questions about anything to do with anybody besides Rashaun Jones, he doesn't remember. Someone else cleared that lead. Someone else cleared that lead. Oh, I don't know. Oh, the fingerprints that were found on the hood of the car, the fingerprints found on the hood that were matched to a guy, found on the hood of the car at the murder scene with the dead body feet away, those fingerprints that were matched to somebody, that guy was excluded. Who excluded him? I don't know. How was he excluded? I don't know. Do you want to review the previous lead detective's report to see if it can refresh your memory about what was done to investigate this person? You reviewed it. Oh, no, didn't refresh my memory. No clue. This individual who Detective Dominguez, the original detective, mistakenly believed was in custody at the time, didn't find that out, didn't realize that mistake had been made, that this one lead, this one potential suspect, was actually out of custody at the time of the homicide. Didn't find that out until after Rashaun Jones was arrested. Didn't find that out until after he had already put Mr. Jones in handcuffs and interviewed him and made up his mind about who the perpetrator was. He was supposed to look at everything again, new, restart the investigation, review all the leads. He had his mind made up. He had his suspect. All he had to do was make it fit, was make the evidence fit the suspect. That is not how it works in the United States of America with the Constitution of the United States. That is not how that works. And that's exactly what happened in this case. Now, whenever you're instructed in a moment, you're going to be instructed that reasonable doubt comes from three places: evidence, conflicts in the evidence, and a lack of evidence. And we've discussed a lot of the evidence already. All the testimony that you heard from the witnesses, the pictures that you've seen. Bruce Johnson testifying he never saw Rashaun with a gun, never had information about Rashaun having a gun. Sherry Abramson saying that she never had any information that Rashaun had a gun. Eric Moncourt saying he never had any information or heard about Rashaun having a gun. Dwayne Hendricks saying the only thing he knows about Rashaun is that he likes to talk about girls a lot. All of that evidence, the cell site data that shows he's in this location, that's consistent with him being at his house, and these 5 hours surrounding the murder, all of this evidence, the information that you heard about Paul Connor and his 20/40 vision at night without glasses, the lighting conditions, 1 to 2 seconds he saw this person, selected him in a photo lineup 7.5 months later. All of that evidence exists because Rashaun Jones is innocent. All of that evidence exists and is reasonable doubt because Rashaun Jones was not responsible for Bryan Pata's death. Let's talk about some conflicts in the evidence. We spoke about some conflicts already, but all the conflicts in Paul Connor's testimony about the train and his car being in the shop, the conflict between what Paul Connor says and what Detective Segovia says, and Paul Connor saying that he'd never made that statement that Detective Segovia said that he made. The Dave Howell conflicts between where he claims that he had seen this gun, that Eric Moncourt, Dave Howell's close friend who spoke all the time, never heard anything about it. Everything in this case conflicts with your common sense, and you're going to be instructed to use your common sense whenever you're weighing the evidence and determining whether or not the government has met its burden to prove beyond it to the exclusion of every single reasonable doubt that Rashaun Jones is responsible. You're going to be asked to use your common sense. and everything that you've heard and the argument that the government is making conflicts with your common sense, conflicts with anybody's common sense. The idea that Rashaun Jones would fail his second drug test and go into such a deep spiral that he wants to commit murder on a person that he got in a fight with 2.5 years ago and had a unofficial thing with his girlfriend a 1.5 years ago. It doesn't make sense. It does not make sense. It conflicts with common sense. Another conflict in the evidence. Detective Hellman was questioned about whether or not he was able to pull all the phone records for Bryan Pata. First of all, we don't have any phone records for Bryan Pata that have been introduced into evidence. When Detective Segovia was questioned about it, he said, there was a bunch of phone records. I'm not exactly sure. But Detective Hellman said he wasn't able to pull the phone records from the Nextel chirps, from the walkie-talkie function on the Nextel phone. Today, when Sergeant Cremicini testified, he did mention that there was some sort of information, some sort of data from a Nextel chirp. That's a conflict in the evidence. Where are those Nextel chirps? Where are those records? Why haven't we seen those? Would it not be useful to see who the people who Bryan Pata were talking to just before his murder are? Where are those records? Where are they? We have Rashaun's records. They don't show a single call to Bryan Pata. There's no calls to him. That's a conflict in the evidence. The not having Nextel chirps, but having Nextel chirps and being able to see, that's a conflict. That's a reasonable doubt. Let's talk about the lack of evidence in this case. There is no gun. No gun was ever recovered. No gun was ever found on Rashaun Jones. No gun was ever found that could be linked to Rashaun Jones. No gun was ever found whatsoever in this case. There is no forensic evidence in this case, besides the fingerprints on the car to the person who was excluded somehow, but you can't really say how. Nobody really knows exactly what was done to exclude that person as a lead. No fingerprints for Rashaun Jones on the scene. No fingerprints from Rashaun Jones on the hood of that car. No fingerprints from Rashaun Jones on a gate nearby. Nothing. Not a single piece of forensic evidence linking Rashaun Jones to this. No DNA either. No DNA on the car. No DNA on the gate. No DNA on anything. No DNA on Bryan Pata's body. Nothing. There was testimony about how they didn't really use cameras back then. But you heard about 2 places where they tried to get cameras from. They tried to get cameras from a hotel, and they tried to get cameras from a Circuit City. This is Dadeland Mall. This is Dadeland Mall. And the government's theory of this case is that Rashaun Jones ran all the way home from Dadeland Mall, or past Dadeland Mall to get to his house. Ran all the way home. Did anybody go to Dadeland Mall and see if there was a camera of the exterior to see if there was anything there that might have shown anybody running past? Did anybody testify that they tried to get cameras from Dadeland Mall and that Dadeland Mall was, didn't have any cameras on the exterior? Nope, nobody tried. Now, the government told you during voir dire, one of the things that they talked about a lot, and one of the things that they may say when they come up here to speak with you again, is that they don't have to prove motive. They don't have to prove motive. They're going to say, it's not an element of the crime, we don't have to prove it. They have to prove a crime that makes sense. They have to prove beyond and to the exclusion of every single reasonable doubt their case. And if they didn't have to prove motive, they certainly spent a lot of time in this case trying. A lot of time talking about this fight from summer of 2004. A lot of time talking about this clip-up statement. A lot of time talking about, these rumors and the situationship, whatever happened between Rashaun and Jada years before. Spent a lot of time trying to prove motive. And they failed because there was no motive. It doesn't make sense. There is no motive because Rashaun Jones did not kill Bryan Pata. How many witnesses were there to testify in this case about any actual evidence at all that links Rashaun Jones to this crime? Maybe if Paul Connor was a credible witness who wasn't nearsighted and farsighted and was wearing his glasses and it wasn't nighttime and he saw this person for more than 1 to 2 seconds and he made a selection from a photo lineup more than or less than 7.5 months afterwards, maybe, but not with those facts. Every single witness that the government called, 99% of their testimony was about stuff from the past, 2 years before. Why were you hearing about all that stuff? The reason you had to hear about this dorm room fight from 2004 and this clip-up statement and this thing with maybe Jada is because that's all they have. That's the only evidence in this case. Those are the pieces of different puzzles they're trying to put together to tell a story. We'll get to that in a second because there is something I missed. Let's talk about Paul Connor again. Paul Connor says he got to the train station at 7:35 and it takes him about 25 minutes to walk home from the train station to get to his apartment complex. And then Detective Segovia testified.
In the statement of fact, he said 6:35, not 7:35.
Okay, rely on your recollection of the evidence.
I'm sorry, if I said 7:35, I apologize. He said he got to the train station at 6:35 p.m. and it takes him about 25 minutes to walk to the apartment complex. And then when Detective Segovia testified, he testified that it would take about 30 minutes to walk to the apartment complex. Either way, he gets there at 7 o'clock. What do we know happened right at 7 o'clock? Jada Brody is on a 911 call, screaming. She had just discovered Bryan. She calls 911 at 7 o'clock, right whenever Paul Connor says that he would have been there. Paul Connor didn't see Jada. Paul Connor didn't see Dwayne Hendricks pull in. Paul Connor didn't see a muzzle flash. Paul Connor saw nothing that would be consistent with what actually happened. And given his confusion with all the dates that you heard about in his testimony and you've heard about with other witnesses, and given his confusion about where his car was, and given the fact that he didn't see anything that was going on at 7 o'clock at this apartment complex, can we even say that, he was there on the day of this homicide? If he's that confused about all of these facts, is the person that he saw even the person who's responsible? Was it a different day? We know the person he saw was not Rashaun Jones, but was it even the suspect? The conflicts in his testimony and the conflicts between his testimony and other evidence that you've heard in this case would say otherwise. And the reason that those conflicts exist is because Rashaun Jones did not commit this crime. Rashaun Jones is innocent. Now I want to use this graph here. I want to talk to you about it.
We're going to object to that. I think it's a missing middle.
Okay, well, let's ask the jurors to step into the jury room. Please turn it so that they're not being hands. All right. Ralph, can you take them into the jury room?
All rise for the jury.
We've seen it judged from error. I think from the state perspective, it's misstates the state's burden. It raises it to a higher level. I think the jury instructions are abundantly clear. So from the state's perspective, it's a missing law.
Yeah, that's kind of like giving percentages for what reasonable doubt is. You're giving shades of colors of. I don't see how that's something that would be reasonable. Do you have a different board or a different sheet? Maybe you could rewrite it in a different way?
It's just a demonstrative, Judge. I think it is consistent with what the law is.
I don't think it is. I think it's more like percentages, and the colors, darkening, et cetera, would go to like a 90% colored in, an 80% colored in, a 75%. The shades are it's just an inappropriate way to characterize it. Any other ones that we're going to need to discuss? I just want to do them now.
Yeah, there are 10 other boards there, we haven't seen any of them.
Okay, why don't we take a quick break, let you all show each other the boards?
Are you going to use any other board?
No.
Okay. All right, so just so you all know, since they're out, it's 6:30, the hour and a half would be, let's say I add 5 minutes or 10 minutes, would have been 6:45. The state still has an extra half an hour, and then I was going to instruct them, which will take another half an hour, and then get them to start deliberating. I don't think it's going to happen tonight, unfortunately. I'm going to ask them when they come back, or when Mr. Roney finishes, if they want to continue for tonight, or they want to come back for tomorrow. Just, we've been, standard end time has been between 6 and 7. So
Judge,
we're not going to get to deliberate tonight for sure.
And Your Honor said, how much longer do I have?
You had, well, you had to 6:45. You started
I
at,
have 20 more minutes left.
yeah, I can add some time because we're taking time off of here.
Well, I think I'm pretty close, and
Whenever you're done.
I would just ask, Judge, that at the very least, the government also give their final close for
They
tonight
had a
and
half an
instruct
hour
them.
left. I'm going to ask the jurors if they're willing to stay. We're supposed to end by 7, but let's see, maybe they'll be willing to stay for that, and then I instruct them tomorrow. Okay? All right, so we'll let you finish, and then I'll ask them.
Yeah, Judge, I do have an objection to that.
Okay, thank you.
All yours are good.
All right, thank you. Maybe see you.
Can I proceed?
Yes.
A couple more things before I wrap up. I want to go back again to Paul Connor. Even ignoring all of the issues with his testimony that we've spoken about ad nauseum, he still can only say that he's 90% sure. Is 90% beyond and to the exclusion of every single reasonable doubt. Taking everything he says is true. There's a 10% chance he's wrong. 1 in 10. Is that 1 in 10 chance? Is that something that will be abiding? Ignoring all the other issues. Is that something that will be abiding? Something that you can lay your head on your pillow at night? Tomorrow.
Objection, Judge, as to the percentages.
All right. Overruled for now.
Tomorrow, the next day, next week, next month, next year. Something you will not be wondering, oh man, it was only 1 to 2 seconds. It was 7.5 months later. It was dark outside. He does only have 20/40 vision. Is that enough to make you sleep well at night? To make you not have...
Objection, Judge, in reading the problems of the jury.
Sustained.
To make you not have that thought in your head, that waver, that vacillation?
Sustained.
We'll just try.
Okay, please disregard the last statement.
Last thing about Paul Connor, no golds. Why did he mention no golds? Did anybody tell him about golds? Going back to the cross-racial identification factor, did he mention that the person did not have gold teeth because it was a black male that he saw and he threw it in? Where does that come from? Bruce Johnson told you that sometimes Rashaun Jones would wear golds on his teeth. Certainly didn't have a clean white smile like Paul Connor testified about. Paul Connor and his selection are not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They are not credible. The other evidence in this case, the other pieces of these random puzzles that the government has tried to piece together for you do not equal murder. The evidence in this case has shown that Rashaun Jones was at home, consistent with his phone records, consistent with his statement consistent with all the evidence and the lack of evidence and the conflicts of the evidence that you have heard in this case. Now, after I sit down, I will not have a chance to speak to you again. This is the last chance that I will get. And we have tried throughout this trial to do everything that we can do to show you, to give you the tools that you need to see the truth, to see that Rashaun Jones did not commit this crime. We have done everything we can. We have tried. When we sit down, there's nothing more we can do, and it's going to be in your hands. And Rashaun Jones said in that interview that you all heard, he tells Detective Segovia, bring in the jury. Bring him in. This is going to have to go to a jury. And 5 years later, you are Rashaun Jones' jury. You're the jury that he...
Wait,
I'm making a promise to the jury.
overall.
5 years ago, Rashaun Jones told Detective Segovia, take it to a jury. Bring a jury in. And you are Rashaun Jones' jury. When I sit down, there's nothing more I can do with this case. There's no more information I can give you. There's nothing more I can do to try and show you the truth about what happened. But I trust that if you use your common sense, if you look at the evidence and the conflicts of the evidence and the lack of evidence in this case, you'll see that the government's case does not make sense. These puzzle pieces do not fit together. This is not a picture that you can see clearly. Rashaun Jones is not guilty. When you review this evidence and you go back to deliberate, find him not guilty. Find him not guilty. Thank you.
All right, thank you. State.
I think I heard the phrase context matters almost 10 times in the last hour, right? If I walk over and shoot my trial partner in the head, you know nothing else, right? But if I tell you that she slept with my husband, if I tell you that we didn't get along, there were issues at work,
Objection,
right?
improper argument.
If I start to give you, right, context to the why some irrational, illogical thing happens, right? Context does matter. Let's just be very, very clear. Every single person that came into this courtroom, that sat in this chair, that gave you a piece, right, of the context that led us to November 7, 2006, that is a piece of evidence. Every single word that escaped every person's mouth when they were asked a question, what they said is a piece of evidence that you, members of the jury, get to use and use your common sense as you are rendering your verdict. When I got up here in opening, we talked about, in order to understand what happened on November 7th, we have to go back, just back, to 2004. We didn't stop there, right? Because it was a 2-year sort of simmering that was going on. Because if we start, right, back to the relationship between Bryan and the defendant, right? It starts in 2004, which the defendant tells you in his own statement, right? That fight that happens, and he says, I cried. In his statement, he says, I cried after that fight.
Objection, mischaracterization of the testimony.
You will get to hear it for
I
yourself.
have your recollection of him.
You will get to hear it for yourself. Go back and play it. He says, I cried. 15 years later, when he talks to Detective Segovia, right, that memory is burned in his mind. That is the beginning, right? He has now been in this situation, right, with the 3 upperclassmen. He gets bested by Bryan, and he looks at that guy and he says, I don't like him. That's where it starts. Then it turns into, right, hatred. Because then what happens, right? The guy who beats him up in a fight the one time, who kind of makes fun of him in front of the other players, right? Because it's a locker room and it's football and it's a bunch of guys, right? Rashaun says, I cried, so it obviously left an impression. Now that's his sort of mark, right? For the next 2 years, they start to have confidence. Starts with partly Jada. We know, they told you, and he says it, they hooked up when they were freshmen. He tells Detective Diaz, we were together for 2 or 3 months when we were freshmen. They were freshmen in 2004. 2005, Bryan starts to date Jada. It doesn't matter that he had a rich girlfriend at some point in 2006. The girl he wanted was with Bryan, Jada. And he tells you in his own statement, he says, she caused problems between us because I would go to her and I would say something to her and she would take it to him. He even uses the word, why are you getting me in trouble with Bryan? Because then, of course, right, Bryan, that's his girlfriend. We know that he was causing issues with all the guys and their girlfriends, right? Would go and be like, hey, verbal altercation would go down. This was 2 years, right, of ongoing toxicity. Call it what you want. Call it locker room antics, call it football players, whatever it was, they didn't like each other. And he is the one who didn't like Bryan. He was insignificant to Bryan. So this isn't just 2004, this one fight happens. This is sort of 2 years, right, of pressure that's being put on Rashaun. And eventually what happens? When there's enough pressure, he cracks. He tells you in his own statement that day, because all of the context matters. He tells you, yes, he got suspended. That was his fault. He got high and he got suspended. Strike 2. But he also tells you, when he tells Detective Segovia, I had a meeting with Coach Coker. Coach Coker was not happy. Crap. What happens? The kid who has a full-time scholarship to UN is on the brink of losing it. You heard from Tony Hernandez, who told you exactly how the drug tests work, right? He had already been tagged because he'd done 2. The next one was coming. Right around that time, what is happening? The guy with the girl who's about to hit the NFL, right? About to make all this money, has everything he wants. There is no logic in jealousy. That's what it is. He goes to blame the person, even though it's his fault he's not on the team. It's his fault he's getting in trouble with Coach Coker. But what does he do? No, that's not my fault. It's Bryan. I never liked that guy, Bryan. Because that's what happens. You start to simmer. He starts to simmer. And he breaks. So then defense says, oh, no, these are these innocent things that he does. These things are not suspicious. They are innocent. It's just innocent that he decides to change his phone on November 7th. Let's sort of break everything down, right? So also to add to the context, let's talk about the 38 first, right? The gun. In those 2 years, context matters, right? In those 2 years, around the locker room, right, he brags about owning a 38. He shows Dave a revolver. Dave sees it. It doesn't matter whether Dave saw it in one dorm room versus another. What's consistent is Dave said, I saw a gun. I had never seen a gun in my life, and I saw a gun. I know what I saw. I know it was a revolver because I used to watch Westerns with my brother. George Hertel tells you that it was a 38 lead caliber bullet. That's what he tells you. And that's consistent with the same type of gun that Dave says he sees. It's also consistent with what Kareem says. It's not weird, right? Actually, it is a little weird that he tells Kareem that. But it's not weird if you think about the context of Rashaun Jones, right? Who's already in a position where he's trying to make himself seem like a tough guy amongst the team. He's messing with everybody.
That's not in evidence.
He's messing with everybody's girlfriend. Like, it's not weird that he's going to go up to an upperclassman to try to make himself look tough. That's what that is. Hey, man, I got a 38. Like, as if everybody's going to think, oh, my gun is cool. That's what that is. That's not some, like, innocuous. Everything plays a part in what was going on here because context matters. By the way, the 38 was the one thing that the Miami-Dade Police Department did not release. It was the one thing that has always been kept under wraps. And the one person that was known to have a 38 that hated Bryan, right? Ill will, hatred, spite.
Objection, Giglio, I have a motion.
Go for it.
Was a defendant. Let's talk about the team meeting. The team meeting that now all of a sudden he didn't go because he was suspended. The thing is the story changes. And the story changes from the defendant's own mouth. From what he tells detectives initially when they first talk to him. When he first tells Detective Pat Diaz, when they first talk to him, it's, well, I didn't go to the team meeting. I got a call from someone who said it was mandatory, but I don't know who called me. That's what he says the first time, and that was back then. Then when he talks to Detective Segovia, it's, well, I didn't go because, I was suspended from the team, and I felt bad. But then it was, I didn't go because I talked to Sherry, and we decided that I shouldn't go to the meeting because I was suspended. I mean, defense says there's no evidence of that he fled out of the state. Members of the jury, I submit to you that night he did flee. He was the only person who doesn't go to the team meeting. And where does he go? To Miami Beach. These records speak for themselves. They are here. Sergeant Cremasini testified. Towers 206 and 209 were the home towers. They were the towers that he frequently connected to, right? Tower 142 was the tower in front of the crime scene. He tells us that towers 207 and 163 are the towers of Miami Beach. We know, right? And he also told us that, based off what Sherry told us, right? Because Sherry also gave us a different story. Sherry's story was, I didn't hear from him. I didn't know that he had been suspended. But then when I heard from him, he told me he had gone for a drive. So when we look at his records, right, and we see, when is it most consistent that it looks like he's moving? Right after the homicide. Sergeant Cremasini told you. He looked at the records and it looked like he was most likely moving right after the homicide. So it wasn't in the afternoon when he had gotten suspended that he went for a drive because he was so distraught about the marijuana. It was after he had just killed somebody. And then, right, then he tells us that around 2109, he says, to about 2219, he hits on those same towers 206. He likely went home. So he kills someone. He's moving around, distraught, panicking.
Objection, mischaracterization of the testimony.
Oh.
Ends up going back home, resetting, and then what does he do? Calls Mike Sanders. I need money. Somebody who's detached, not somebody on the football team, not his girlfriend, somebody who's detached. I need money. I can't tell you why. I won't tell you why. Mike Sanders is so weirded out by that he goes down to the HEC Center to tell coaches and tell detectives what it was about that call. It wasn't, I need money because I'm broke because I can't pay for lunch tomorrow. It was, I need money, I won't tell you why. If it was that he was this broke college student, why not just say, hey, I need money because I can't have dinner tonight? So, but that's just an innocent fact, right? When we look at it, when we look at that, just taking that fact on its own, sure. But now, when you put it into the context of what's happening, Bryan is dead. Bryan dies on November 7th. He gets shot in the head. Not 3.5 hours later, when he's supposed to be at the University of Miami mandatory team meeting. It is not a regular meeting. It is not a football meeting. It is not weightlifting. It is a mandatory meeting because a player has died. Somebody on the team is dead. And he doesn't go because he's worried about his suspension, because he's so upset at himself. Somebody's dead. But he's calling somebody and asking for money. And then He ends up going to Miami Beach, which let's keep looking at the records, because what time does he get to Miami Beach? Sergeant Carmesini told you it was almost at 23:36. That's 11:36 is when he starts to get to the area of Miami Beach, where he's gonna go stay with Sherry, which he told Detective Segovia. And she told you, yeah, he came to my house that night. She said, oh no, he came early. He tells Detective Segovia, I got there at like 8:30.
Objection, mischaracterization of the testimony.
You can hear it for yourselves. Yet at 1 a.m. is the only time that she's arguably blowing up his phone. At 1 a.m. he was already supposed to be there. Miami Beach, which he has to cross a big bridge with a body of ocean to get there. I submit to you it's a pretty easy place to toss a gun out of a window. It's not till 1 a.m. that he ends up with her, because her last phone call and his last phone call is like 1:19 a.m. that day. So that's when they're finally together. So he does flee. He does ditch the meeting. And he does go to Miami Beach. He doesn't lie low there. He blames it on the suspension, but he goes because if he shows up to UN, he's going to be caught. Let's talk about Sherry. How convenient when defense argues that she couldn't remember. She was so genuine in her not remembering. She was covering for him. She tells detectives around the time of the homicide, right in 2007 when she first talks to them, I was worried that he was going to get blamed. Detective Pat Diaz told you. She said, I was worried he was going to get blamed. Why would you be worried that your boyfriend is going to get blamed for the murder of a player that he didn't get along with, when according to you, you never even talked about the fact that they never got along? Then it was, I was worried he was going to be dead. When asked the logical question, because of course Bryan's dead, so of course she assumed he was going to be dead because Bryan was dead, so maybe they got into it. It was, oh no, somebody else got shot. What's so interesting, or what I find so interesting, is her brother was on the football team. Yet at no point did she say, oh, I was worried about my brother. She told you Ross Abramson was on the football team. At no point, she's worried about him, but she's worried about him because UN players are getting shot, but she's not worried about her brother. I was so worried about him, I blew up his phone. You can absolutely look at these records for yourself. The only time that she is blowing up his phone, where they really make contact, is by 11:30. And she told you she was worried because by the time she gets told by Willie Cooper, at that point, nobody knows where Rashaun is. Nobody knows where he is. He's not at the meeting. He's supposed to be at the meeting, but we don't know where he is. Then she says, oh, I started calling people frantically looking for him. I asked her to point to the 386 number of his grandmother. She says she called the grandmother. It wasn't on her records. She also says she starts blowing his phone up, but because she hadn't heard from him. But his records show that they were in communication. They were talking. So she knew where he was. She wasn't really that worried. But then what does she do? She's a little worried, he's going to get blamed, starts to do what, a loyal girlfriend does, cover his tracks. She said, I knew Coach Swayze, I called him. She doesn't really blow him up until almost 1 o'clock in the morning. By that point, he was supposed to have already been there, according to what he tells Detective Segovia. And listen, if you want to say, there's been a long time, maybe he got the time wrong. It's very different to say 8:30 at night that you went there versus 1 o'clock in the morning when he got there late that night. And it's also very interesting when the memory is selective, because you remember, right? You remember that fight with Bryan where he made you cry. You remember Bruce Johnson calling you and telling you the meeting was mandatory. But then it's selective. Oh, I don't remember, that I went for a drive. I don't remember, the random little things. Then he says his phone was off. Again, he says at some point my phone was off. I didn't want anybody to contact me. I didn't want anybody to know what was going on because of my suspension. Except he's on the phone repeatedly. He's on the phone on this phone, and he's on the phone on his 973 number before he changes it. The records are right here. You can look for yourself. He is on the phone. So he was either, you can't have it both ways. You can't be just so distraught that I want my phone off and I don't want anybody to contact me, but I'm talking to everybody that I want to be talking to. Because he does call home. He says he doesn't want home to know. Home is here, and he talks to home. So you do or you don't. Changing a phone number is not some random innocent thing that happens. Sure, taking this fact alone on November 7th is one thing. But when you put it into the context of what happened that day, it's different. Defense says, he just changes his number, no big deal. No, he changes his number because he's hiding. He is hiding because he has cracked at that point. He has decided, I am going to Bryan's house and I'm going to confront him after practice. For whatever that reason may be. He chooses to change his number. He chooses to go down there, right? And he chooses to shoot Bryan in the head. Which, by the way, defense has ignored the fact that we know from even just the body itself and the photos that you saw. His cash was in his wallet. His car keys to his luxury SUV were untouched. This was not a robbery. This was personal. This was personal. Nobody else wanted Bryan dead but Rashaun Jones.
Objection. Facts not in evidence.
Rashaun Jones hated Bryan. That is an element. Ill will, hatred, and spite. That is what this case is about. It is about a kid who was so jealous, who was the cause of his own downturn, but blamed the one guy on the team that he didn't like. He went down to his house to confront him, and he shot him. It was not a robbery. It was not anything but something that was personal. Let me just point out, I want to round out a little bit of Sherry. I think she was asked by defense, did he tell you that he had anything to do with it? And she was like, no, absolutely not. That she selectively remembers. The girl who couldn't remember what she had told a reporter 5 years earlier because now her memory has changed. The girl who now says, oh no, he wanted me to talk to police. He wanted me to talk to them. You heard from detectives, when they showed up, they didn't even expect him to be there. He was there driving her car, and he says, no, you can't talk to her. This wasn't police can't talk to my girlfriend. This was, you can't talk to her because I don't want her to talk to you. I don't want her to tell you anything alone. And it was, you can talk to her, but I gotta be there. Because he wanted to know what the police were asking. Detective Hellman and Detective Diaz told you exactly what went down. Let's go. I'd like to talk a little bit about his statements to police, because I think that, again, the most inconsistent statements are really from the defendant. First, it's the firearm. No, he says I never owned a firearm. There are at least 5 other people who came here to talk about him with a firearm.
Objection. Facts not an evidence. Mischaracterization of the testimony.
Okay, you're relying on recollection of the evidence, you can continue.
The only one who says, well, I never saw him with a firearm, the girlfriend, no.
Objection. Mischaracterization of the evidence.
The revolver that he bragged about in the locker room, that all the players had heard about.
Objection. Mischaracterization of the evidence.
The revolver that he showed to Dave. But no, he tells detectives, when asked, well, if they all came and they said it, are they lying? Yeah, no, they're lying. Then he says, same thing with Mike Sanders. So if there's a call on your phone records where you're calling Mike, asking him for money, that call, that's a lie from Mike? What motive, what does Mike have? Why would Mike make that up? Who wasn't even on the football team. He was adjacent. He tells detectives he decides to skip that meeting because he was so upset. Telling me you're already on thin ice with the coaches and the team and you're not going to show up to a meeting where someone's dead. And that's the reason of the meeting that you know is mandatory. The only person not to come. This is, and by the way, this isn't, again, an isolated fact that defense says, oh, this is innocent. They took the innocent fact that he didn't show up to that meeting and everybody ran with it. That's not what happened. The reality of the situation is that the pieces have always been there. Everything in this case pointed to one person, and it's the person sitting right there.
Objection. I have a motion.
Including the identification by Paul Connor. Paul Connor, you heard his testimony. Defense cannot have it both ways. They cannot argue that he's honest about, the one thing, but then he's dishonest about the other stuff. Let's be very, very clear. Paul Connor has no reason to lie. Paul Connor is an independent person who was walking home that day. He didn't have his car. He took the metro. He walked home. He tells you he remembers it was 6:35 when he got off the metro. He is an academic, a professor. He was shown eventually, let's talk about, he walks down, he says he hears a bang, and immediately after hearing a bang, he sees the defendant walking out. The person smiles at him and keeps going. He says in his testimony, he turned his head and he saw the person moving away quicker, hurrying away. He keeps walking to his apartment. He doesn't see Bryan's body. They showed him the photos. He doesn't see Bryan's body that is on the floor covered by the bushes. He makes his way to his apartment, which is around the complex. The next day, he goes to police because he sees the news and he says, I saw something. He tells them what he saw. Description and recognition are two different things. Describing somebody and saying, here are the facial features that I have described to this person, and recognizing someone are two different things. When he was given that lineup, he recognized the person that he saw that day, and that was the defendant. Which, by the way, he also says, which he wouldn't have known, that the lights to Bryan's car were still on. And that, conveniently for Bryan, because he changed his car for the locks to be with the 60 seconds, tells us that he was there right around the time of the gunshot. Especially because he hears it, Then he sees the defendant going away, and then he makes his way back. Paul Connor was honest. He said to the second photo that he's shown when Detective Segovia goes to see him, which is not a lineup. Detective Segovia told you it was not a lineup. All he did was show it to him, and just show it to him so that he could just look at it again. It was not a lineup. This is the lineup. The photos are all dark because they have to be the same. The photos here are all blue. In the other lineup were all blue because the photos all have to be the same for the particular suspect that they were looking at. Here it was Rashaun Jones. He identifies Rashaun Jones. Paul Connor testified that he was a professor and he had 20 students in his class. He said it in his testimony. There were like 20 kids in my class. This wasn't that Rashaun Jones was in his class and they maybe crossed paths. He saw him that night. Description and recognition are two different things. He recognized Rashaun Jones, who defense gets up here and says he was on the UM football team, big player. He played one game. You heard from the coach. By the way, he was given two lineups. He was given the other lineup first, and it was a lineup of also 6 black men. He doesn't identify anybody there. He says there's nobody there that matches the person I saw. He's then given the second lineup, so he looks at 12 people. And out of the 12 people, he picks out Rashaun Jones because that's the person he saw that night. Clean white smile. Nobody asked Sherry, the girl who was making out with him all the time, what his mouth looked like.
Objection, burden shifting.
Oh,
What, logically, what would you expect? Paul Connor is walking, right? And he says, the person smiled at me and walked away. What did we think that person was going to do? Hey, I just shot someone. Don't say anything. I'm going to get on my way. Of course, don't be suspicious. He's just shot somebody, walking out, making his way, and then scurrying away after the person turns away. It's not weird. He's covering his tracks. Consciousness of guilt. The defendant's behaviors. When people know that they've done nothing wrong, they don't lie, they don't hide, they don't lie about where they were. Ordinary human reactions. In the context of what is going on. All of the pieces can be in a file. That is why there are cold cases. Detective Segovia told you one of his oldest cases was from 1956. All of the pieces can be there. Detectives were working on the case. Let's be very, very clear. When the judge instructs you on the law, you are going to see that time is not a defense. There is no statute of limitations for murder. I believe he did it, but I don't like the time. That is not a reasonable doubt. I believe he did it, punto.
Objection, burden, diluting the burden.
oh.
I believe he did it, full stop.
Objection, diluting the burden.
Oh.
That is an abiding conviction of guilt.
Objection, diluting the burden. I have a motion.
Okay, overruled.
Time is not a defense because there is no statute of limitations to murder. The facts don't change. Memories may fade, but in the end, everyone here experienced a trauma. And you want to argue the gun in the dorm room was here, he remembered the gun. He remembered the revolver. Every single witness that testified experienced a trauma. The death of Bryan Pata. Whether they were a friend of Bryan or a friend of both, they all as a team experienced the death of a teammate. A 22-year-old in their 20s. That is something that stays with you. The big things stay with you. There is a reason why Mike Sanders has remembered. He may not remember exactly how much money, but he remembers getting that call. And you know what? It's in the records. Is Mike lying? You are not tasked with the decision about time. You are tasked with deciding what happened on November 7th, 2006. Like I said in opening, The defendant's actions paved a path. His behaviors, his timings, his communications, it is the context of all of those combined circumstances that allow you, members of the jury, to render a verdict of guilty. This is a circumstantial evidence case. We have talked about all of the pieces, right? Like a rope that is made up of many different strands. Independently, they may be nimble. But when put together, right, when put together, they form a bond, an unbreakable bond. And that is what we have. Every single piece, everything that happened, starting from 2004 all the way through and past November 7th, every road points to Rashaun Jones. He is the only person who wanted him dead.
Objection, I have a motion.
He was jealous. He didn't like him. It is illogical, but that is what happens when someone is faced with an insurmountable pressure. And he was in his 20s, and he did the illogical, and he did the unthinkable, and he did what he shouldn't have done. He killed someone. And members of the jury, that is why, and after all of the evidence that you have heard in this case, the state is absolutely confident that when you go back into that jury room and you review each and every single piece of evidence, including the testimony from each and every witness that took that stand, because that is all pieces of evidence. As we talked about in jury selection, physical evidence, just like testimonial evidence, the law says is weighed the same. When you take all of that, including all of the context, back into that jury room, you will render the only verdict that justice demands, and that is that the defendant is guilty of the murder of Bryan Pata. Thank you.